This is Todd DeHoop, and welcome to the Motocross Vault.
Hello and welcome back to the Motocross Vault. My name is Tony Blazier, and what this video is going to cover is a look back at the history of Suzuki's iconic RM250 two-strokes. Produced from 1976 through 2008, the RM250 was Suzuki's flagship motorcycle through most of its run. Unfortunately, the four-strokes have kind of pushed the RM250 out of prominence in the mid-2000s. But while it was in production, it was a great motorcycle for most of its run. There were a few years here in the mid-80s, mid-90s where it maybe wasn't the best bike available, but overall the RM250 was very competitive most years. They had a very specific brand of power and handling, certainly from the early 90s on. Suzuki went much more aggressive than some of its competitors, but if you like that sort of thing, it was definitely a fun machine to ride. I've had a couple of these over the years. Some I liked, some I didn't. Some of them I liked quite a bit, actually. Some of them were some of the best motorcycles I've ever owned. But this is going to be look back year by year at the history of the RM250 and what Suzuki did to develop it, and also how it kind of fared a little bit versus its rivals at the time. If you like this sort of thing, you can check out some other retrospectives I've done. I've done retrospectives on like the CR500, the CR250, several other models I've also done. I just did one recently on some off-road models as well. So if you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the other videos. I have off-road ATV and motocross content available on the channel. If you like to support what I do have Motocross Vault merch available. I have several different designs, both from the off-road, ATV, and motocross world as well. And if you're looking for something specific, maybe unique, I'm happy to put your name and number on the back, do your specific motorcycle. Just let me know, drop me a line here in a DM on the channel, or you can also hit me up at the Motocross Vault at gmail.com, and I'd be happy to see if I can come up with something kind of custom for you. So here, without further ado, is a look back at the history of Suzuki's RM250 from 1976 through 2008. For Suzuki, the RM250 story starts in 1976 with the introduction of the very first RM250. The year before, Suzuki had introduced the first RM in the form of the RM125, but in 1976, they introduced the 250 and 370 version to much fanfare. Previous to the introduction of the RM250 in 76, Suzuki's entry in the 250 class had been the TM, which had been a decent play bike, but never much of a serious racer. Suzuki billed it in the early 70s as, having a lot of shared DNA with their works motocrossers, but the reality was the TM was really a budget machine. It had pretty poor suspension, mediocre engines, and notoriously flexy chassis. The bikes were, again, decent play bikes, but they weren't really much competition for the new Honda Elsinores and Yamaha's awesome YZ line. But here in 76, Suzuki finally came out with a true competitor in the form of the RM250. Now, this new machine was all new from the ground up, and was Suzuki's first offering to offer the long travel suspension in the 250 class. Up front, it offered 8.6 inches of fork travel, and in the rear it had laid down dual shocks, which featured 8.4 inches in the back, which was excellent for the time. At the time, Yamaha had kind of rewritten the motocross game with their monoshock, single shock, long travel suspension, and it offered a great deal more travel than the shorter suspension found on the Elsinores when they had first come out. This made a huge difference in the handling of the machines, and certainly the ability to go fast in rough terrain. The new RM also featured a stout chromoly frame that was much stronger and lighter than the old mild steel frame on the TMs. This was a huge improvement. That was really one of the major problems with the TMs. They were notoriously weak in the frame department, and that caused some problems in the handling, particularly on the TM400s, which had way more power than the flexi chassis could really handle. And that was never an issue with these RMs. The new chromoly steel chassis was the stoutest frame in the class at the time. Really an improvement in every way. Bikes were excellent handlers. The new chassis was light, strong, and handled very well. The motor was a air-cooled engine. Of course, air cooling was the only way these bikes were being produced at the time. But they did have an all-new design that featured a kind of an interesting hybrid intake system. At the time, there was basically two. You had a piston port design, which the old TM had used, Honda's Elsinores were using at the time, which was basically an unencumbered intake. Now, these designs were excellent for mid to top power, but they tended to lack in low-end torque. They weren't particularly efficient at low RPMs, and when Yamaha came in with their torque induction reed valve system, it was a big improvement in low-end response for these two-stroke engines. Now, Suzuki here in 76 went with what they dubbed the power reed, which was an interesting combination of the two technologies. It had both a kind of a piston port design, and then it had a reed valve, which was basically fed fuel into the lower case, like almost like a semi-case reed design. Suzuki claimed at the time it would give you the benefits of both Yamaha's torque induction, which gave excellent low end response, and the freer flowing high RPM power you were looking for on some of the other piston port designs. It gave the RM excellent power characteristics. It wasn't the fastest machine in the class in 1976. A lot of people said like the KX250 was actually quicker than the RM, but it gave it very broad and easy to ride power, which was a perfect match to the chassis at the time. The bike was a very good handling machine. Riders praised the ergonomics of the RM. Had really nice look to the bike too. This is one of my favorite looking bikes of all time. This RM250 in 76 is a really handsome machine. They did a good job with the overall look. It certainly looked very much like the kind of bikes that Roger DeCoster and the factory guys are riding at the time. And this was built as a works replica, and this was much closer to a works replica than any of the previous TMs had ever been. Really, the only thing they had in common with the bikes Roger were riding were the color. And other than that, there wasn't a whole lot there. But this RM really could be said to be like a poor man's works bike. It was an excellent machine, and really the first in a long line of really competitive machines for Suzuki here in the 1970s. For 1977, the RM250 was back with a surprising amount of updates. The bike had been a huge hit the year before. Many people felt it was the best machine available in the 250 class at the time, and Suzuki was out to build on that success here in 1977. The most dramatic update is the reconfiguration of the bore and stroke of the motor. Suzuki went with a longer stroke design here in 1977. The overall displacement remained the same at 246cc, but Suzuki repositioned the crank pin to give it a longer stroke. In order to keep the displacement the same, they made the bore smaller here. They also reconfigured some of the porting, and all this was done to give the machine a more torquey and responsive delivery. The chassis was updated slightly here for 1977. One of the issues that had come up with the 76 was the swing arm was known to flex and crack if the bike was ridden very hard. And here for 77, they redesigned the swing arm, added a box sectioning to it to add additional strength and flex resistance. And they also repositioned the shocks slightly. The shocks were all new to go along with the new positioning. That they added a remote reservoir here for 77 as well to fight fading. Overall travel remained the same as the year before. There was 8.6 inches of travel here in the rear with the laid down dual shocks. Up front, there is a slight rejiggering of the telescopic fork. It offers 8.7 inches of travel here for 77, and they changed the springs and the damping as well to hopefully improve handling. One other issue here in 76 was the airbox, which tended to be not only a nightmare to service, but also did not seal very well. It was very easy to get the filter not in there properly, and then if you suck dirt into the motor, obviously that was not a great thing. So for 77, Suzuki redesigned the airbox to be both easier to service, more secure, to make sure that you didn't have any dirt sucking issues here for 77. The tank looks the same at first glance, but it is a new design that repositioned the filler gas cap slightly off center to make it easier to fill the machine. Still made of aluminum. Gorgeous, gorgeous design. Like I said, this is one of my favorite looks of all time for Suzuki. This is a great looking motorcycle. And like I said, at first glance, the only thing you'd probably notice is the remote reservoir shocks. If you're looking at a 76 versus a 77, there's not a whole lot of visual difference there. But the overall machine is still a gorgeous bike and a very competitive machine in the 250 class here in 1977. 1978 is an interesting year for the RM250, and there's actually two different RM250s introduced this season. Similar to what KTM does currently with their factory editions, they introduced an all-new, updated machine halfway through the year in the form of the RM250C2. But the RM250C was more or less the same machine as the B, the 77 model, with a few minor upgrades. Most significant of those was an all-new fork, which upped travel by about an inch and also added air adjustability for the first time. Of course, today, most people look at the air Schrader valves on their forks as a way to bleed off pressure, but in the 70s, this was considered a way to tune the fork by adding or subtracting air pressure to kind of supplement the springs. This air adjustability gave the machine infinite tuning capabilities, according to press releases at the time. This new fork added, as I said, the air adjustability as well as longer travel and a larger oil capacity as well here for 1978. The motor was more or less the same with the exception of an all-new expansion chamber, which Suzuki was trying to put on there to kind of bring the power down, give it a little meatier delivery. You have a fatter midsection in the expansion chamber and a longer silencer here for 1978, which was done to improve power and bring the sound down a little bit. Along with the new fork, you have a all-new hub in the front. It's a conical design, which was better for cooling of the front brake and also lighter. There's also a new set of chain adjusters here for 78, which were taken from the PE line. They also updated the airbox once again to make it a little easier to access. The opening at the top is a little larger to hopefully let your hands in there a little easier. Other than those changes, the RM250C is a really similar machine to the year before. If you're looking for serious updates, you would need to wait till mid-year and the introduction of the all-new RM250C2. A mere 7 months after the introduction of the RM250C, Suzuki introduced the 78.5 C2. Now, as you can see, this is a much different looking machine on the outside. This is the first significant update to the styling and bodywork on the RM250 since its introduction in 1976. Visually, you can see the fenders are redesigned. They're larger, longer, wider to give you a little more protection. I don't know that it's necessarily more attractive. I think that's debatable. I think actually the first generation RM is a better looking machine than this, but I think Suzuki was feeling a little pressure. You had the all new CR250R Elsinore making its debut this year, which was a real rocket of a machine. And of course, Yamaha was very competitive in this year as well. So there's a good bit of competition in the 250 class, and Suzuki certainly felt the need, even though they were considered probably still the best bikes in the class the previous 3 years, to kind of keep up with the competition. Kawasaki also coming on with their redesigned KX250 here in 78 as well. So there was a great deal of competition in the 250 class, and Suzuki was trying to keep at the top. So in addition to the new fenders, you have an all-new tank. The tank this year goes to a plastic design, so it was certainly more crash resistant. Again, I don't think it looks as nice, but that's a personal choice. Some people probably do prefer the look, but it was more durable. You wouldn't have to worry about, like punching a dent into it or something like that. The plastic was more durable and certainly has a more squared off design rather than the round design of the earlier RMs. In addition to the new plastic, you get all new suspension this year, and that's probably the most mechanically significant change. You have longer travel forks and shocks, front and rear. This new RM punches out nearly 10 inches of travel. New bikes like the CR Elsinore were actually getting close to a full foot of travel at the time, and it was pretty quickly changing year over year in terms of suspension travel. The travel wars were hot and heavy here in the late 70s. And Suzuki was feeling the pressure to kind of keep up with the competition. So up front, you have a set of Kayaba air oil spring forks with 248 millimeters or 9.8 inches of travel. Out back, you have the Kayaba gas charged shocks, and they still keep the remote reservoirs for fade resistance. And they offered 9.7 inches of axle travel. They also added this year adjustability for the first time. Earlier shock designs did not allow you to adjust the compression or rebound damping, and this year there are a whole 2 adjustable settings. And interestingly, you have to take the shock basically apart to make any change. So it wasn't like you're going to go and start messing with that mid-motor or anything, but there is some adjustability built into the design. You also have an all-new swing arm this year. They went to an aluminum swing arm here for the first time. As I'd said, early RMs, that's one of the weak areas was the swing arm. So there was a fairly robust market for aftermarket swing arms on the early RMs. And here in 78, Suzuki comes with a much more upgraded alloy swing arm that was designed to, again, be more durable and flex resistant. The motor is very similar to the one introduced earlier in the year, but there is new porting, and it makes a huge difference in terms of the power. Suzuki claimed the new porting gave the machine a full 5 horsepower increase over the regular 78 model. So big difference in terms of that. And the motor does run much differently. It has a stronger top end pull than the previous design. And that was, again, to try and keep up with some of the rockets in the class, the 78 CR250R. I actually own that bike, and it was an absolute rocket. It's a really fast motorcycle. And Suzuki was kind of keeping up with the Joneses there at this point, trying to bump up the power. They claimed a total of 35.5 horsepower at 8,000 RPMs, which was very similar to the CR250s. I think the CR250 was claimed to be like 36, so it's getting up there. Of course, today, 125s put out that kind of power, but at the time, that was a very potent 250 mil. Ergonomically, as I said, the bike is all new. You have the different shaped tank, slimmer tank. They also reshaped the saddle this year to be a little better, more comfortable at the seat tank juncture, and also offer a little lower seat height as the suspension got taller. Of course, these bikes are getting pretty tall. And they shaved down a little bit of the foam here for 78.5 to keep the seat height under control. You also have what Suzuki calls a full floating front handlebar, which was essentially just adding rubber grommets into the handlebar mounting to allow for a little reduction in vibration. And you also get what they call a quote-unquote bone saver front number plate. Now, if you see the number plate now has two little tangs that wrap over the crossbar. And that was done actually with these early motorcycles with the drum brake. That cable could actually get caught with the handlebar. And if that happened and the suspension topped out, it would pull the front brake with predictably horrible results. So overall, I think this is a much improved machine. Certainly performance-wise, it offers more performance than the 78 model. And it was a significant upgrade in pretty much every way on the track. For 1979, we get another all-new RM. Amazingly, after only a few months on the market, Suzuki basically retired the C2 model for the all-new 1979 RM250N. I'm not sure why it skipped the rest of the alphabet this year, but they went right to N for some reason. This bike has significantly more travel than the 78.5. In the rear, the suspension went all the way from 9.7 inches to a full 11.8 inches. Up front, the forks increased in travel as well, going from the 1978.5's 9.8 inches to the 1979's 11.2 inches. This was still a little bit shy of the CR250 in 1979, but a great deal more than the previous machine, and certainly closer to what the class standard was becoming. This new machine also gets a new motor. It's still an air-cooled power redesign. It does have a completely new clutch mechanism. One of the issues earlier RM pilots had was the clutch mechanism, which was kind of stuck out the side of the clutch. There was actually the arm coming out of it, and it would actually kind of interfere with your ability to get to the brake pedal. Sometimes people would actually step on this instead of the brake. It was also notorious for needing adjustment, and they moved this to a totally different internal design here for 1979. The frame is all new this year. It's still a chromoly design. The bodywork is similar as far as the tank and seat in terms of appearance, but you get all new fenders front and rear. This is a very controversial year for the appearance of the RM. I personally think these fenders are just ridiculous looking. The early pre-production ones have kind of a duckbill look on the front and the back. Apparently later through the year, the ones that came to the US had just a duckbill in the back, and they went to a little bit more normal looking front fender. The early press bikes had this front fender design, and also some of the ads and literature have it. But like I said, they did away with it maybe because they got a lot of negative press. I'm not sure exactly what prompted that, but like I said, it's most of the RMs you find will not have that duckbill in the front. The rear was certainly a strange look. It was a unique look. Suzuki was certainly going for something different this year, but to my eyes, it's pretty weird looking. By this point, the FIM was requiring GP bikes to have the number plates moved rearward so they were easier to read. With them right on the side of the bike where your legs are, I'm sure it was hard for scorekeepers to keep track of that. So the FIM required this. RMs here this year went to a more quote-unquote modern style of side plate. I don't know that it necessarily cleans up the looks. Like I said, I actually prefer the looks of the earlier RMs, but it certainly gives it a little more modern look anyway. On the track, it seems this was not a particularly successful machine. Most of the tests I read at the time, the testers did not like the motor particularly this year, and also the handling was really derided. They said there were issues with the front end washing out in turns, the bike kind of wallowing in the rough and sand and what have you. As they went to this longer travel suspension, you were having trouble with some of these forks being particularly flexy, these 38 millimeter forks. When you start stretching them out to a foot of travel, you get a lot of flex there. And I think they were still kind of working out the kinks of this long travel suspension. When you started doubling the suspension travel in such a short amount of time, there's bound to be some kinks to work out. And it seems like this 79 model was full of kinks. They definitely had some issues there. And it seems like most of the testers in the magazine weren't particularly impressed with this particular model RM250 here in 1979. For 1980, the RM250 was back with a fairly modest list of updates. As I said, in 79, the machine was all new from the ground up, so this 80 model is pretty much just a refined version of the 79N. This year it gets the T nomenclature, so this is called the RM250T. Again, I have no idea. The early models went ABC, and that seemed to be perfectly fine, but then they started jumping. This is one of those things that kind of we've gotten away from in time. They don't really even mention that anymore, but these early bikes certainly seem to have that as something that's always mentioned in their names. They're the actual indicator there. So this is the RM250T here in 1980. Styling wise, you get the retirement of the goofy, in my opinion, duckbill fenders. This 1980 model looks much more like the fenders that were on Roger DeCoster's bikes, the work style. And to my eye, at least, it's a much more attractive. It's a minor change, but it really transforms the looks of the bike. That strange 79 fender combination was just a little too much for me. And I think the 80 model, in spite of not being really that much different, looks a lot better. The tank this year is increased in capacity slightly. It went from 1.9 gallons to 2.2 gallons. You also get new shocks that allow for the remote reservoirs to be removed and oil change to be done. So a lot of these early shocks weren't easily serviceable, and this year you can actually change the oil in the shocks, which I'm sure was a welcome addition for riders who do a lot of racing. The rear brake, as I said, the year before was a bit of a problem spot. They tended to stick on if it was muddy or really hot and dusty. And here for 1980, they went to a cable-operated rear brake instead of the rod that was used the year before. They also added a return spring to help getting that brake not to stick on. The front brake, unfortunately, did not get this feature, and they still were some issues with the front brake sticking as well. This was a thing that happened in the old drum brake days that obviously when we went to hydraulics you won't have to worry about, but it was one of those minor aggravations, or major aggravations, I guess, if you had your brake dragging. One of the nice things that they did with the 79 model was they moved the countershaft sprocket closer to the swing arm. If you look at some of these early long travel bikes, particularly Yamahas and stuff, they had really complicated chain guides and stuff to keep the chain from derailing, because the long travel really put a huge strain on that chain. And this 1979 and 80 model, they moved it closer. They were kind of figuring out that the best way to keep the chain in line was to move the countershaft sprocket as close as possible. And here for 1980, you get a new chain guide that is a little more secure and does a better job of keeping the chain from derailing. Motor was identical to the year before. They really didn't make any significant changes. Suspension-wise also, there wasn't a whole lot of change here in 1980. They really went with basically the same design other than the rebuildable shocks in the back. This RM was very competitive in 1980. The motor was very responsive. I think most people thought it was a good handling bike in general. I still did see some people complaining about the front end washing out in certain conditions, but it seems these long travel bikes could be a little bit finicky at times. Particularly the RM was one of the tallest bikes in the class, and it seems like the tall chassis gave people who were used to like more low slung older machines a bit of a pause. It seems like that had to be quite a transition to go from bikes with 3, 4, 5 inches of travel that sit really low to these skyscrapers like this RM, which sit basically as tall as a modern bike does. And I'm sure that was quite an adjustment period. It seems like some riders have issues with it, others didn't. But overall, I think most people would say this 1980 RM250 was a very, very solid overall machine. For 1981, the RM250 is back with probably the most significant update since its introduction in 1976. The 81 RM is the first one to feature the all-new full floater rear suspension system. Now, this is a fairly controversial topic. If you're not aware, Suzuki was actually sued by a gentleman by the name of Don Richardson, who had designed the original idea for the full floater. Suzuki had entered into an agreement with him to jointly develop the system, and then basically, as court documents would show, basically screwed him on this. Suzuki would be sued by Mr. Richardson and actually lose this lawsuit and have to pay him for the usage of his design. Now, at the time, of course, the average Joe did not know this. In fact, I remember throughout the entire time the RMs used the full floater in the early 80s, I never saw this mentioned once in any of the magazines. But if you'd like to know more about this, my buddy Steve Mathis here at Pulp MX did a great podcast with Don where they kind of go over the ins and outs and stuff. The guy was very smart and really did get screwed here. But that being said, it certainly was a revolutionary design at the time. The secret to the full floater is that it does not have a single hard point on the frame with a single linkage like a traditional system would today and all the other competition in 1981 used. It has a full floating design, hence the name, where the shock is connected to a linkage at the top and the bottom. In 1980, Kawasaki had introduced their version of a single shock linkage suspension called the Unitrack. And here in 81, you also get Honda introducing their version, the ProLink, as well. The ProLink is basically the system that we use to this day. Everybody kind of decided within a few years that that was the ideal design in order to get simplified manufacturing, a lower center of gravity on the bike, and basically keep the cost under control. This original full floater is a pretty complicated design with several pull rods and, as I said, a linkage on the top and the bottom, but it worked great on the track. It was a real game changer for Suzuki at the time. The bike is much slimmer through the middle. They got rid of the dual shocks, and that was one of the beefs there with the RMs. A lot of people, when they jump off the Yamahas and the new Kawasaki, they would really notice the bulging side plates on the dual shock design. The move to the single shock here does eliminate that. The RM250 also gets an all-new frame. Clearly, to use this rear suspension system, it needed to totally redesign the frame here in 1981, and they did that. The only downside to the full floater is basically the shock takes the place where the airbox used to be, and the RM uses a kind of a weird dual filter system that was a real pain to service. But performance-wise, this 81 shock was excellent, and by far the best performing rear suspension in the class in 1981. Now, as to the rest of the bike, you have an all-new motor as well. This year, they finally did away with the semi-case reed power reed setup and went to a full traditional reed valve on the RM250. You get an all-new cylinder design with revised porting. You also have a revised transmission. The ratios, they say, are the same as the year before, but the transmission itself is new with a repositioned clutch activation and pretty middling performance. It seems like the bike was pretty torquey down low, good mid-range, but very flat on top. Very responsive. At the time, they were saying they thought it'd be good for like supercross and stuff, but outdoors, the motor kind of went flat a little bit, but it was competitive. None of these bikes had power valves in 1981, so you kind of had to choose where you wanted your power. They didn't have the wide power band of a modern two-stroke. You kind of tuned it to have good top end or a good low end, then you had to kind of focus on that because you really couldn't vary the porting once it was designed. Up front, the only weak link on this 81 that really all the magazines talked about was the forks. Interestingly, in 1981, the RM465, the open class RM, got a 43 millimeter fork, which was pretty much the standard size you'd see on all motocross bikes throughout the 80s until the advent of the inverted forks in like 1989. The 43s were at the time considered very beefy and very flex resistant. But here on the 250, Suzuki went with a RM125 fork, a 38 millimeter fork, which was much smaller, much more flexy, and it really was noticeable. The rear suspension worked great, but they said as soon as you rolled off the throttle, the front end dived and the forks weren't up to taking the task. They were really a little bit underperforming here in 81, and most people said that's probably the major weak link in this 81 RM. Motocross Action even suggesting going with an aftermarket fork, which is obviously something you wouldn't see today, but I guess Fox and some other companies at the time made forks you could just swap them out. In any case, that was really the one complaint they had. It said once you got the fork sorted, it was the best 250 here in 1981, and certainly a really big game-changing year for RM250 design. For 1982, the RM250 gets a major update in the motor department. This year, it moves to liquid cooling for the first time. In 1981, Honda had moved to liquid cooling on their CR250, and this was the first 250 to do this. Early on, some people thought that really open bikes and 250s didn't need liquid cooling. It was pretty much exclusively thought to be needed on 125s, but as they would show, all bikes would benefit from the liquid cooling because it allows the motor temperatures to stay more consistent, which in turn allows the engineers to run tighter tolerances in the motor and also allows things like jetting to be more consistent. The result was a fantastic motor here in 1982. The bike's power band is very pro-oriented. It runs completely different than the 81 design. It has very mediocre low end, but excellent mid-range and top end. That is by far the most top end of any 250 here in 1982 and is a really, really fast machine that all the magazines described as a rocket ship this year. The rear suspension is still the full floater design, and here in 82 you get some updates to the valving, but the basic design stays the same here, not a big change there. Up front, interestingly, Suzuki once again stayed with the 38 millimeter forks. This year they did increase the wall thickness of the sliders to hopefully reduce some of that flex that people had complained about the year before. But once again, with all the other manufacturers going to beefier forks, it is noticeably flexier. Now, one side benefit of going with the smaller forks, and I think why Suzuki had done it, was to save weight. The RM250 here in 1982 is the lightest bike in the class. It is a full 17 pounds lighter than the Yamaha, which is pretty crazy when you think about it, and 15 pounds lighter than the Honda. The bike is very light, despite the liquid cooling making its debut. The machine was a pro-oriented machine this year. Like I said, the power band is very potent but demanding. Pretty much all the magazines commented that the stock RM is faster than any of the other bikes even modified. It was just an absolute rocket. Of course, the move to liquid cooling does demand some changes to the bodywork, and you get an all-new tank this year. And interestingly, not all the manufacturers had the same idea as to where the radiator belongs. Here in 82, Yamaha also moved to liquid cooling on the YZ, and they stuck with their unique radiator mounted up on the triple clamps. This was a design that was not only complicated and prone to failures over time, also adversely affected the handling of the bike. You really could feel that weight up on the handlebars. And Suzuki here went with a more traditional placement. I think they were still experimenting with all kinds of different places to put all the stuff, the shock designs and the radiators, all that stuff was still kind of in flux. But this lower design below the tank is, as you can see, basically what we use today. And it turned out that this was a better design overall, and that's what everybody's gone to over time. This RM was a excellent machine, and pretty much as long as you were fast enough to make use of its potent motor, was considered the best bike in the class. The forks, again, were the weak link, but it wasn't enough to hold back the rest of the bike, which was extremely impressive. And this is probably the best RM250 probably for another decade. It was a really, really great machine here in 82, and basically the unanimous choice as the best 250 motocrosser this season. For 1983, the RM250 looks almost identical to 82. Really, the only visual cue is the new blue seat. Other than that, the bikes look to be the same, but there's actually a surprising amount of changes here for the new model year. The new machine is longer overall. It has a 15 millimeter extension of wheelbase. It sits 10 millimeters taller. It has more rear wheel travel by 8 millimeters and a shorter shock spring by 20 millimeters. They upped the leverage ratio of the shock and also changed the transmission. First gear remains the same, but the other 4 gears are revised here with new ratios for 83. There's more trail, less rake, and a bigger sprocket in the rear. The motor has all new porting this year. It's the same basic design as the year before, of course still liquid cooled, but no power valve. They did not have a power valve yet. In 1983, the only 250 to have a power valve is Yamaha, and it shows in terms of the power available on the YZ this year. The RM runs completely different here for 1983. The motor went from a top-end screamer that everybody pretty much praised and loved, but Suzuki went to a torquer here in 1983. The machine has low to mid torque and no top end whatsoever. It runs completely differently than the year before and seems to be pretty much unanimously panned by the motorcycle press. I'm sure some novices liked it. As I said, the 82 was really fast. At the time, it was actually almost scary fast for some inexperienced riders. It was so potent, and it seems that Suzuki was trying to mellow it out a little bit, make it a little more appealing to the everyman, but I don't think they were particularly successful this year in the motor department. The front end of the bike is all new as well. You get finally a move to the 43 millimeter forks to stiffen up that front end, give it a little more steering precision. You also get a all new front brake, which moves to a dual leading shoe design. This was one of the last manufacturers to go to the dual leading shoe here in 1983. And what that did was basically when you pulled the lever, it pushed out the brake shoes from both sides at the same time. Before, you had a cam only on one side, and it basically only pushed on the brake shoes from one side. When you went to the dual leading shoe, it had a linkage that would allow both sides to press at the same time and give you more power. Still wasn't as powerful as like a disc, but it certainly was an improvement. Suzuki was a little behind the times in braking in 82, and here for 83, they kind of brought them up to speed with everybody else. The bike is still competitive. The suspension is still the best in the class. The full floater works phenomenally. It seems like most people like the way the bike handles, but the motor is, again, disappointing to most. After how fast the 82 model is, this much mellower 83 seems to be kind of disappointing in terms of overall performance. The bike is still light, even though the forks went to the 43 millimeter, which is certainly a little bit heavier. They did change the strut here in the full floater suspension to an aluminum design to kind of offset some of that. The bike is still very light, but it no longer has a huge advantage over its competition. Here in 83, Honda made a lot of changes to lighten their CR250, and it's pretty much in line with the RM. By most people's assessment, the Honda, I believe, is considered a better bike here in 83. The RM still was very competitive, as I said, very good machine, but if you were not a novice, you might want to get a little motor work done to kind of bring that power back that's missing from the year before. For 1984, the RM250 gets an all-new look here, which is very similar to the works bike Mark Barnett had ridden the year before. You get all-new bodywork, a redesigned frame, upgraded suspension. Pretty much the only thing that's not really upgraded here for 84 is the motor, which is more or less a revamped 83 RM250 engine. The new frame is painted blue this year. It gives the bike a really nice updated appearance with the blue seat, the blue fork boots. I always like this yellow and blue kind of mid-80s Suzuki look. And I think the bike is pretty handsome overall. The machine, as I said, has a new frame. And one of the nice things about this is that it moved away from the really aggravating dual air filters used in the RM. Since the full floater came out in 1981, this new design uses a large single air filter, and that made servicing much easier here for 1984. You also get, as I said, all new bodywork with updated side plates and a more modern look. The strange Suzuki duckbill platypus fenders in the front kind of were an iconic design of the time. Even back in 1984, I don't think everybody loved this look. I certainly was not a big fan, but it's definitely Suzuki. Has a unique look to it. Suspension is upgraded front and rear here for 1984. The front forks are still a 43mm Kiyaba design, but they have 0.6 inches more travel here in 1984. And you have all new settings and a revamped valving for the 84 shock. Still the single shock full floater design, the original full floater, but they did make several revisions to improve performance here in 1984. The motor, as I said, is basically the same design as the year before with some minor porting changes. And really that's the main problem with this bike. It's very competitive. The new frame features steeper geometry, gives the bike better handling, but the motor is still no rocket ship. It's significantly slower than the Powerhouse CR this year in 1984. The bike was a good kind of a novice to intermediate machine, but if you're looking for a really fast motocrosser, the 84 RM250 wasn't it. The bike, as I said, is very competitive despite that, though, because it has the best suspension in the class. The front forks and rear suspension do the best job of smoothing out the track, and to many people that is a significant advantage, depending on what your priority is. The dual leading shoe front brake, which was a big deal the year before, here in 84 is the back of the pack. By this point, you have Honda and Kawasaki both using discs, and even the dual leading shoe on the Yamaha this year is superior in power and feel to the RM. That's definitely a demerit here on the RM's category. The front brake was pretty mediocre, particularly in contrast to the discs on the front ends of the Honda and Kawasaki. They were much more powerful. The RM's weak front brake was certainly a handicap. If you're trying to outbrake somebody to the first turn and they have that disc brake, they definitely had an advantage over you here this year. And that was one thing that wasn't easy to really fix. Some things like suspension, you could get revalved, but brakes, you're kind of stuck with whatever it has. And that was definitely one of the issues with the RM this year. It was the back of the pack in terms of braking performance. Overall, this 84 machine is improved in a lot of ways. As I said, it has the best suspension on the track. It handles pretty well, but the motor was kind of disappointing. It wasn't really anything more than a middle-of-the-pack performer here in 1984. For 1985, the RM250 is back with a list of small but important improvements. Visually speaking, the bike looks very similar to 84 except for the addition of some gold rims. Personally, I love the look of the gold rims. I always thought that was a great look here in the mid-80s, and it looks good on this RM. You also get a front disc brake here in 1985, which definitely addressed one of the weak points of the 84 RMs. The engine is painted silver this year. Other than that, visually speaking, the bike pretty much looks identical to the year before. Inside the engine, there's an all-new long rod design that was done to boost low to mid-range power and hopefully bring the RM a little bit of the horsepower it's been missing the last couple of years here in 1985. Chassis-wise, the frame, the suspension, all that was basically identical from the year before. The bike was all new in 1984, so for 85, they really didn't make any serious changes in that realm. Most of the concern was in the motor department, and that's really where they focused most of their changes here in 1985. Now, on the track, this new RM had much stronger mid-range power, and it was a much improved engine. You get a 2mm larger carburetor. The flat slide carburetor goes from a 36 to a 38mm design, hopefully give the machine a little better top end, deeper breathing. It still wasn't a screamer by any means. This bike is not the fastest in the class in 1985. That title went to the Yamaha YZ250, which was much more powerful than all the other stock machines, but the bike is competitively quick. It has good mid-range power, and it continues to have the best suspension in the class. It is considered an excellent machine for any rider below the pro class in stock condition. Dirt Bike actually picked it as the best 250 here in 1985, and Motocross Action picked it as the best intermediate to junior machine. They didn't think the stock motor was potent enough for the pro class without a little bit of massaging, but the overall machine was very competent this year, and it was a solid improvement over the very mellow 83 and 84 RMs. Very, very good bike here overall here in 1985. Here in 1986, the RM250 is once again all new, but by most people's accounts of the time and today, it wasn't really a great year for Suzuki. You'll notice, first of all, this is the first year that Suzuki went away from the original full floater design. Now, this was done, I'm sure, for many reasons, not the least of which was certainly the lawsuit they were embroiled with Don Richardson that they would eventually lose. Maybe in 87 or 88 is when it finally came to conclusion, but certainly they knew the writing was on the wall. They had to go away from that design, and they went with an interesting and unique eccentric cam linkage this year. They went to a bottom link design similar to what everybody else was pretty much using here in 1986, but instead of using a traditional set of rocker arms, they went with the eccentric cam that in theory probably was pretty effective, but it was prone to a great deal of stiction and was never particularly successful on the track. The suspension this year is actually back of the pack, and that was the first time Suzuki had this problem, maybe since the RM was introduced in 1976. They had always been known for the suspension. Even in years when the RMs weren't fast, they were well suspended. And here in 86, the RM kind of falls down on all counts. The bodywork here is all new, although it still has a very unique Suzuki look. You still have the kind of interesting fender design, but you have new tank, new shrouds, new side plates. Lawsuit aside, moving to the bottom link had other benefits. It did allow them to slim the midsection and lower the center of gravity considerably. The original full floater was a very large design with a high center of gravity, and I think going to this other more traditional design allowed Suzuki to kind of slim up the packaging and give the bike a little better weight balance. The motor is all new this year as well. It gets the blue look, and really that's my favorite thing about this bike, the yellow and blue with the blue engine. I thought was a cool mid-80s look, but this motor is very disappointing. This is the first year that RM went with a quote-unquote power valve. They were using a exhaust resonance chamber similar to what Honda was using with the ATAC system. It did not have a variable exhaust port like the Yamaha and later Honda power port designs would have. It basically uses just a resonator to change the pipe volume and in theory give the bike a wider power band. These exhaust resonant chambers used independently, I don't think they were ever particularly effective. It did make a little bit of a difference, but I think they work much better in a design like Kawasaki's Kips or most modern two-strokes used now, where they're used in conjunction with a variable exhaust port. But this first design does not have that, and it was pretty much a rever. There was no low to mid-range power here in 86. The bike is very underpowered down low, and it's pretty much a screamer on top, and very difficult to ride. The suspension, as I said, is poor. It's harsh, prone to stiction, and most of the magazines rated it as back of the pack here at 86. The brakes, even though their discs are underpowered compared to the competition, they definitely are way less powerful than the new Kawasaki with its dual disc setup, and even Honda with its drum and disc combination had much better brakes here in 1986. The bike is really a disappointment all around. Suzuki definitely took a big swing here in 86. They completely redesigned the bike, but about the only thing that people raved about was the turning. Apparently the RM did have excellent turning this year, but the rest of the machine was pretty disappointing. And I think by most standards, this is considered the low point for Suzuki's 250 class offerings in the 80s. It's kind of the nadir of their 80s designs, and from here at least it would be nothing but up. For 1987, the RM250 is back with a visually similar but much improved machine. This bike has the same bodywork as the year before, but pretty much everything other than the plastic is all new. They ditched the motor of 86 completely. Interesting, it's a one-year design. Here for 87, they go to a traditional power valve with a variable exhaust port. They ditched the original design after the terrible reception it received in 1986. They also got rid of that controversial eccentric cam linkage and went with a traditional bell crank, similar to what everybody else was using. This is a complete redesign of the full floater. Now, they're still using the full floater, but of course, that's just a marketing thing. None of these suspensions after 1985 use a full floating shock. It is a more traditional linkage, just like you saw on a CR250 of this era. The motor, as I said, uses a new Suzuki automatic exhaust timing controlled, a pair of guillotine-style valves, similar in design to what some of the competition were using to vary the exhaust port height based on RPM. Forks are cartridge this year, which is a huge improvement. Now, this is something that Honda had in 1986, and these work-style cartridge forks allowed a much wider range of damping, much like the power valve allowed the motors to work over a wider range of conditions and widen the power band. This cartridge designs allowed the suspension tuners to set up the forks to work over a wider range of conditions, and they were a huge step forward in terms of performance here in the mid-80s. So you get an all-new shock here in 87, all new forks, an all-new engine, new frame to work with the revamped suspension, and really, other than the styling, the bike is all new and hugely improved. You get a rear disc brake here in 1987, the first time they went with that, and they upped the pistons on the front brake here for 87 to a dual piston design to give it more power, and that as well is a big improvement here in 1987. Now, the bike is not the class of the field. Pretty much most people, I think, would probably say Honda was the best bike here in 1987 by a pretty wide margin, but the RM is much more competitive. It's no longer the dog of the 250 class where if you're on RM, everybody kind of just snickered at you and said, good luck. This bike was pretty competitive. I actually rode one back in the 80s, and I thought I was very impressed with it. It had really good mid-range power, not the top-end rocket that the 87 Honda was, but the suspension was very well sorted here in 87. The forks work well. The bike handles well. Other than looking old and slightly cobby, the bike was a pretty good performer here in 87, and certainly a big improvement in pretty much every way over the terrible 1986 design. For 1988, the RM250 is back with a list of updates that on paper don't look very dramatic, but they turned out to make a pretty large difference on the track. The bodywork is slightly revised here. You'll notice the seat and tank is the main visual cue. For 88, Suzuki lowered the radiators almost 2 inches on the chassis and put an all-new tank and seat design on the RM250. The overall bike looks very similar to the year before. The fenders are still uniquely Suzuki, but they do get a new tank that is more attractive, and certainly lowering the radiators helped in the handling department as well this year. The frame is new with revised geometry. The steering head was moved out 0.35 inches, and the rake was pulled in 1 degree here for 1988. This was done to give the bike a little greater stability and improve turning overall. The motor here has new porting, a new revised power valve, and a move to an all-new Mikuni quote-unquote slingshot carburetor. This flat slide carb was supposed to give the machine more efficient fuel metering, crisper overall jetting, and it also added the ability to set the idle on the machine. This had been a big problem the year before. One of the aggravating things about the 87 RM was that it was prone to stalling, and you couldn't really adjust the idle circuit on the bike, and this is definitely an improvement. Made it less likely to stall the machine in the heat of battle, which I'm sure many people appreciated. The machine itself was much improved here in 88. There were some changes to the forks, and the overall competitiveness of the machine was much improved. The motor, even though it's really not a dramatic change, has a huge increase in power. When Dirt Rider tested the 87 and 88 back-to-back in their dyno, the 88 pumped out 6 more horsepower. It was a tremendous improvement. The 87, as I said, was a good low to mid kind of fun-to-ride motor, but it wasn't particularly fast, certainly not as fast as the Honda. But here for 88, the RM is actually the rocket of the class. It's really a fast machine, and Suzuki did a great job here this year with the motor. It's really a big improvement overall. The new ergonomics helped the handling of the bike. It was a pretty decent handler in most people's minds. Motocross Action did have some quibbles about it, saying it didn't turn very well, but it seems like that was an isolated thought. Most of the other magazines thought the bike handled well and liked the overall handling of the machine. In fact, several of them picked the RM250 as the best 250 motocrosser here in 1988. It was a really good year for Suzuki overall. Really, about the only thing people would kind of quibble with was the look of the machine, which was starting to get a little long in the tooth here. But there were better days ahead pretty soon for the styling on the RM250. This is, again, if you're going to go for a mid-80s Suzuki, this is by far the best one to get. It was a really good machine here in 1988. After an excellent outing in 1988, the RM250 was back for 89 with a all-new design. If you look up on Wikipedia the story of the ugly duckling that turned into a beautiful swan, I think you'll see a picture of this 89 RM. This is a gorgeous motorcycle. As I said, I did not really care for the styling of the earlier RMs. I thought the fenders were a little bit weird. Always had that kind of duckbill look to them. And while the 88 was not a terrible looking machine, certainly the new tank and shrouds improved its looks immensely. The 89 is just gorgeous from top to bottom. Again, this is my favorite color combo. The RMs came in the blue and yellow. Just clean, iconic design. It's a gorgeous motorcycle. In addition to the new bodywork, you get an all-new motor this year in 1989. They went to a case redesign, which is something you saw more commonly on 125s. The case reed shortened the intake track, and tended to give bikes excellent top-end power. They weren't always the best in terms of wide power band, and low-end torque seemed to kind of suffer on some of these larger case reed motors, but Suzuki went this way in 1989 with an all-new design. You add a low boy pipe this year. The pipe is 3.9 inches lower on the chassis, and the new bodywork significantly lowered the tank as well. So the fuel, the 2.2 gallon tank carries its fuel lower on the chassis to centralize mass and improve handling. The new bodywork is slimmer, flatter on top, makes the bike easier to move around on. It really is a kind of a home run in terms of ergonomics. I think the only people who complained were maybe taller riders who felt the layout was a little bit cramped, but overall it's really a giant step forward in terms of the ergonomics and the modern layout of this 89 RM. Another big change this year is they went to an inverted fork for the first time. In 1988, the conventional fork had been praised for its action, and this new 41mm Kayaba design is probably not better in most people's minds, but it certainly adds more rigidity to the front end, which is what they were going for. They were trying to get more precise turning, and in that realm, the RM definitely succeeded. This new chassis is an excellent handler in terms of turning. This is kind of the first RM that really starts that trend that continues to this day to have really, really sharp turning machines with a little bit of a schizophrenic note at speed. The bike is not particularly stable, but it turns excellently. Clearly a supercross handling package. And in terms of handling, this RM, certainly if you like a bike that turns, was a good step in the right direction there. Again, high speed stability, not its forte, and the bike can be pretty sketchy at speed. The power band this year was, not nearly as successful as the 88. The 88 motor, like I said, was an excellent engine. It was the horsepower king of 1988. It put out just over 40 horsepower. And this new 89 motor actually has less horsepower than the old engine. And really, when you look at the two dyno curves here, 89 versus 1988, the real tell of the tape is the torque curve. Basically, on a torque curve, you want a rising, flat crescendo like a mountain. You don't want any dips. You don't want any kind of spots where the torque kind of drops off. And that pretty much describes this 89 motor. As you can see, the torque curve, although the max torque is higher by a little bit, the curve is very erratic with a lot of dips in it, and what that translates to is a power band that's kind of doesn't feel like it's long and strong pulling. It has dips in its delivery, and the bike kind of feels flat on top. The torque drops off as the horsepower climbs, and that gives you a power band that feels less full and broad than the 88 was. The bike was still fast though. It was quick more than it was fast. The power band was short and punchy. This erratic jumps in the torque give the bike that kind of traditional hit you're used to experiencing, and depending on your kind of style and what you like, maybe that's good, but I think most people thought the 88 motor was actually much better. The suspension this year worked well. It was not phenomenal. It wasn't like, night and day, the best suspension in 89. 89, actually, the conventional 46mm forks on the KX, actually, most people thought were the superior front end. But this inverted design was not, terrible by any means. It was certainly a million times better than Honda's first inverted offerings. The Shawas this year were just terrible. And these Kayaba forks were certainly not bad in that way. They were pretty good performers, just not as good as the old conventional in everything except maybe front-end rigidity. I'd say overall this RM was a huge improvement in some ways and a step back in others. It certainly was no longer in the running for the top 250 machine of 1989 like it had been the year before. The bike could be more fun in certain situations, certainly was better looking. Ergonomics were improved. But in terms of raw performance on the track, it was more of a give and take, where the 88, despite some of its older technology, was probably a better machine overall. For 1990, the RM250 was back with a list of modest updates. As I said, the machine was all new in 89, so you wouldn't expect a total redesign this for the second year. The motor was one of the weak points of the 89 RMs. The motors were not only rather anemic, they were also fragile. They tended to blow up when pushed hard, and that was a pretty common issue in 89 for guys who rode the RMs in sand and put them under a lot of stress. So Suzuki made some updates here in 1990 to try and improve power and also increase durability. First up was new porting and a revised power valve that extended the guillotine valves 2 millimeters more into the exhaust port at low RPMs, essentially lowering the port height. When they were fully engaged and open, it was the same, but at low RPMs, the power valves extended farther down into the cylinder. You also get a redesigned head that lowered the combustion chamber by 3.3 millimeters, but retained the same overall volume, which resulted in better combustion for 1990. The airbox is revised to allow more air into the motor, and the baffles were redesigned around the air filter to help block water better for 1990. Internally, the cylinder featured a new liner for 1990 that Suzuki coined SCEM, which stood for Suzuki Composite Electrochemical Material. It was a composite of nickel, silicon, and phosphorus that Suzuki claimed was slightly harder than the old boron composite liner they used in the past. This was done, of course, to increase durability and reliability. They also added a molten plasma injection treatment to the piston, again, to hopefully increase durability and prevent the failures that some of the RMs had suffered in 1989. The clutch cover was new this year. This is the first year that Suzuki added a quick release to the clutch. This was something that Honda had put on their CRs back in 87 and was a pretty glaring omission in 89 on an all-new machine that Suzuki did not deem it worthy to put it on their RM250. The new clutch cover required them to redesign the water pump slightly, and it was moved forward and tucked up behind the pipe a little better, so it actually worked out that it was more out of the way and better protected if you were actually to take a fall. The chassis was very similar to the 1989 version. They did make some slight tweaks to the overall geometry to hopefully increase stability slightly. As I said, the 89 was a turning demon, but it was pretty loosey-goosey at speed. Unfortunately, I don't think any of these RMs are super stable, but they were trying to tweak it a little bit to get a little better performance and make the bike a little less sketchy at speed. The overall ergonomics are the same, and this is again, a great looking motorcycle. I will say that if I had to pick one RM that's the best looking of all time, I think it's this 1990. I just think the graphics here for 90 are a little better. It's gorgeous, and certainly things take quite a turn after 1990 here. This is when I think of a Suzuki RM, this is the one I think of. It's just a gorgeous, iconic looking machine, and they certainly knocked it out of the park in terms of appearance this year in 1990. Overall performance this year was better. The motor certainly was still no powerhouse. It was not as outright powerful as the new KX250 or as broad and smooth as Honda's excellent CR250R motor. It was very punchy and potent, but it did have a little more power than the year before. But again, it was more of a short shifter. It was a burst motor, not a long, strong pull like the Honda. Suspension, though, was excellent. This 1990 has awesome suspension front and rear, and several of the magazines picked it as having the best overall suspension. And the handling was excellent as long as you like turning. Again, if you favor turning over stability, the bike was an excellent handler. If you were riding a lot of high-speed tracks or wanting to take it out of the desert as a play bike, the ARM was probably not the best machine for that. Despite its solid handling and excellent overall suspension, the RM didn't win any shootouts this year. I think most people favored either the awesome power of the Kawasaki or the Honda, which had much better motors this season. I will say that the Suzuki certainly was very competitive. I don't think you were at a huge handicap riding the RM this year. It just required a different riding style. You're going to have to do a lot more shifting than you would have done on some of the other machines, but the bike was certainly capable of winning in stock condition, and it was a very capable machine with a little bit of modification. For 1991, the RM250 was back with a completely new look. Despite most of the bodywork actually being the same, this new bodywork certainly looks different. They went with a very interesting change in color scheme this year. As I said, I thought the 1990s were my favorite and best looking RMs of all time. And this 91, particularly when it came out, I hated it. I thought it was just horrible looking. Now I think it's pretty cool. You know, time kind of changes that. Nostalgia certainly plays a role in that. But they were certainly going for bold this year. They moved from blue for the frame to yellow, and then added this, I don't even know what you call it, splotch seat. Always kind of looked like a cat barfed on your seat to me. And white shrouds with the graphics. Now, other countries other than the US, I think look a little better because the shrouds and what have you are actually yellow on those. They didn't go with the white. I'm not sure why we did that here and not anywhere else. But in any case, it's one of those love it or hate it designs. I'm sure there were plenty of people who thought it was great at the time, but I thought it looked ridiculous. Certainly the graphics on the side panel were a bit strange, considering you're actually, if you're going to race this thing, you're going to take those off. Although I did see the occasional dork putting the numbers on over those things, which really looked terrible. I'm sure the scores love that. But in any case, Suzuki made a bold change in terms of styling here in 91, and it certainly got a lot of attention. In addition to the new graphics, you get actually a fair amount of updates here for 1991. The motor this year gets new exhaust port timing. They once again kind of rejiggered that. They changed the port timing, the exhaust valves, and that was to totally improve low to mid-range power delivery. You get a new intake manifold and a new reed valve. It moved from a 6-pedal reed to a 4-pedal reed for enhanced response and better mid to top end power delivery. The exhaust pipe and silencer are all new to develop a smoother power delivery according to Suzuki. They went to an O-ring head gasket this year to allow more precise cylinder head temperature control and more accurate carburetor tuning. They improved the cylinder head coolant flow and radiators as well to foster better cooling here for the new, more powerful engine. The piston material was changed once again. They went away from the coating they'd used the year before, and this new one contains 7% more silicone for improved durability, and the connecting rod strength was also increased for 1991. The crankshaft inertia was increased by 10% to give a smoother power delivery, give the machine more of a torquey delivery. Like I said, these 89 and 90 motors were punchy, but not particularly torquey. They're kind of a revved up quick, felt very light flywheel, kind of like a big 125. And I don't think, I'm sure there probably were some people that liked that, but in general, I think more people preferred the smoother delivery of like what Honda was making at the time. Third, fourth, and fifth gear are updated here for 1991 and strengthened. They also improved the shift cam stopper plate to smooth out shifting. The RMs actually were excellent shifters in this era, but they actually shifted maybe a little too smooth, and missed shifts were probably more common. Unlike the Yamahas, which were stubborn to shift, the RMs shifted so easy you could just nudge the shifter and accidentally get a shift. So they were kind of trying to find the right balance between ease and not shifting accidentally. The new steering geometry was added to the frame this year to improve steering, make it a little quicker. Certainly interesting considering these bikes were already the most quick handling on the track, but here in 91 they claim they're trying to make it even more sharp turning. The frame was strengthened to complement the additional rigidity of the new forks. The forks themselves were all new here for 1991, and in an interesting move, Suzuki moved to Showa as their suspension provider. Prior to this, I mean, I don't remember any RM that had not used Kayaba suspension up to this point. But they did add an all-new Showa fork, a 45mm fork. It was still inverted. And again, this is very interesting because Honda had gone to the inverted Showa forks in 89, and they were terrible. The 1990, I actually had all three bikes in 1990, all the Hondas, and they were awful as far as the forks go. So a lot of people were kind of scratching their head when Suzuki moved to Showa here for 1991. But this new 45mm fork was a little more advanced than what was on the Hondas. The Hondas only offered compression damping. The Suzuki version, for whatever reason, offered compression and rebound adjustability, and turned out to work much better on the track. The steering head was new as well to, again, hopefully increase steering precision. A new shock here was added for 1991. It was a Showa unit and offered 40% more oil capacity for more consistent damping throughout the race. The swing arm was slightly updated here for 1991 as well. A new chain guide was added that was stronger and offered increased ground clearance to prevent it from catching in ruts. And improved linkage bearings offered smoother and more consistent movement on the full float reverse suspension here for 1991. To aid rider comfort, the seat had a more grippy material here in addition to being very interesting looking, and the foot pegs were enlarged here in 1991 as well to improve rider comfort. On the track, all those changes added up to an improved but not really different Suzuki experience. If you think about the RM250s of the early 90s, this 91 is probably the best example of what Suzuki was going for. The motor is hard-hitting in the mid-range, but there's not a lot of power below that middle surge. There's not a lot of top end or low end. It's really a dead center power band that's very fun to ride, but again, you're going to be shifting a lot more than you would be on the CR. The handling is excellent for turning, still a little wandering at speed, but depending on the type of riding you're doing and the track you're on, maybe that wasn't a disadvantage. It seemed that most people had a problem with it when they were jumping from other motorcycles. If you rode the Suzuki all the time, you kind of got used to its kind of hyperactive feel. But if you're coming off a Kawasaki, it felt a little sketchy. The motor, though, was very competitive. The handling, very competitive here in 91. And the suspension was excellent. Surprisingly, the move to Showa didn't ruin the RM suspension. If anything, it was even better. The rear shock was rated by most of the magazines as the best this year. And all the other testers seemed to rate it either first or second in terms of fork performance. The Kawasaki was stellar this year as well. But the RM got excellent ratings and was picked of at least one or two in terms of the overall suspension rating. So this bike handled well, was fast, and well suspended. If you were looking for a supercross-focused, quick-handling, fun-to-ride punching machine, this 91 RM was an excellent choice. Now, if you're looking for a magic carpet going down the straights that would hold to its line, not go all over the place, you'd be much happier on the Kawasaki. If you were looking for a smooth, easy-to-ride power band, certainly this wasn't it. This was a bike that required you to be aggressive and kind of ride the wave of that mid-range surge to make it work. But if you did, it was very competitive and an excellent machine overall here in 1991. Dirt Bike actually picked it as the top 250 this year. And as I said, it was very competitive and really kind of the very definition of what Suzuki was going for here in the early 90s in terms of RM250 performance. All right, we've officially reached the zenith of the early 90s motocross styling mania with the arrival of Suzuki's 1992 RM250. This bike is actually not much different than the 91, which really wasn't a whole lot different than the last 2 years, but it looks a lot different. The styling is, again, love it or hate it. Now I actually kind of love it because it's just so crazy 90s, but back in 1992 I thought it was utterly absurd and ridiculous. This year Honda went to the nuclear red, which I thought was also quite strange at the time. But like many things, absence makes the heart grow fonder, and over time I think people have warmed up to this design. Aside from the ridiculous looking graphics, the 92 RM is not a whole lot different than the year before. They made some subtle changes to the motor, reconfigured the scavenging ports and exhaust ports on the RM250, and they did add an additional clutch plate to the motor to give it a little better drive. The clutch was very light on these, very light feel of the lever, but they tended to fade if you're pretty hard on the clutch, so Suzuki was trying to beef that up here for 1992. Up front, they received an updated Showa fork. You still have Showa suspension this year. They made some changes to make it more reliable, less prone to have dust seal problems and fork seal problems here for 1992. New valving as well. The rear suspension is updated with the revised rear shock that featured a larger piston and a larger cylinder for better oil flow. The motor, like I said, is not a whole lot different. It gives a little bit more oomph, but the motor is still primarily just a mid-range only, very quick revving, hard-hitting engine that kind of turns over fast and demands another shift. The bike was very fast when it was on the pipe, but it was tricky to ride. If the track was dry and hard, if you're out there at Carlsbad on a Saturday afternoon, it was probably pretty brutal to try and get this thing to hook up. It certainly was a better at home if you had a lot of traction. You could put that hard-hitting engine right to the ground. A couple little minor changes they made on the brakes here as well for 1992. Suzuki updated the front rotor to be stiffer and more resistant to bending, and they also increased the width of the rear rotor to be more fade resistant. They also increased the strength of the calipers too to try and give the machine a little bit better braking feel. On the track, this 92 bike turned out to be not nearly as good a machine as the year before. The engine is very similar. Like I said, there's not a whole lot of difference between 91 and 92 in terms of engine performance, but the suspension this year, they seem to have got all the settings out of whack. Where they were really successful in 91, the bike was very well liked for its shock and forks. Here in 92, the shock is pretty much felt to be the worst shock in the field, and the forks are very harsh and more like what you would have found on a Honda at the time, which just weren't very good. I think most people thought the 91 was actually a better bike in most every way. Despite the more bold looks, I think you'd be better off with a year-old RM than the 1992 model. For 1993, the RM250 is back with an all-new look that I certainly, particularly at the time, thought was a huge improvement over the 92 design. I think now I actually kind of prefer the 92 bodywork, but at the time in 1993, I thought this all-new look was a big improvement. Certainly the all-yellow, more conservative look, the yellow seat, the kind of grayed-out frame, it had a really clean and more professional look to my eye, and I thought it was a big improvement. The bodywork is all new this year. You get a interesting full coverage shroud that made it easier to keep your decals on there because you don't have to worry about gas fumes coming through. And the bike is actually pretty chunky through the middle. Earlier RMs, some of the riders, I guess, had complained that the bike was actually too narrow and hard to kind of hold on to. And here in 93, Suzuki actually increased the width of the bike, put little extra dummy covers on the airbox in order to make the bike wider through the middle to give you a little more purchase to grab with your legs in the rough. I think if you get on the bike after riding one of the earlier ones, it definitely is wider. When I rode it back in 93, I didn't notice a real big difference in terms of being able to hold on to the machine. I didn't have a problem with the previous design as far as that goes, but I think some riders did think it was an improvement. The engine this year is updated, but not all new. It still uses the case redesign it had employed since 1989. You do get a new cylinder with revised porting. The cylinder also moves the head stay from the front to the back. Suzuki said this was done to improve chassis balance and also reduce vibration. The clutch is beefed up for here for 93, and you also get an all-new carburetor. It went from a 38mm McCuney to a 38mm Kaheen here for 1993. The reed valve was redesigned as well, and the reed block was reduced in size to increase fuel velocity. The airbox was enlarged. It wasn't just wider, it actually breathed a little better too. to get a little more air into the motor, hopefully to produce more power. Radiators were all new this year, and a new exhaust was added with a redesigned pipe and a new silencer, which was slightly smaller for 1993. Chassis-wise, the RM was all new. That is probably the biggest change here, aside from the new appearance of the machine. The frame was completely redesigned. It has like a box section construction that was used on the RM125 in 1992. The new frame was 35% stronger than the old design, and Suzuki did that to improve precision and make the bike more stable in the rough. The suspension remains sourced by Showa with 45mm inverted forks up front and an all-new shock in the rear. The rear shock had a larger 25mm compression adjuster, which allowed more oil to fill through the body, and featured revised valving and higher quality oil for 1993. For 1993, Suzuki updated the triple clamps as well and moved to a solid construction. The old RM used a rubber-mounted clamp, and while that was good for isolating some vibration, some riders complained that they wobbled and were prone to twisting and to crash. On the track, the all-new RM really wasn't a whole lot different than the old bike, despite all the changes. It really maintained the same basic personality it had the year before. The new machine was stiffer, certainly, but it still handled very much the same way. It was very sharp in the turns, a little bit sketchy at speed, great jumping machine. It was certainly a fun bike to ride, but the burst motor and lively chassis made the bike somewhat demanding to race. It certainly required a good bit of effort to put that power to the ground with the short, hard-hitting power band, and the bike could be a handful for less experienced riders. Guys who were fast and liked to jump were pretty happy with the machine, but it definitely was a more demanding bike than some of its competitors. The suspension here in 1993 is slightly better up front, but still poor in the back. The front forks work decently well. They were mid-pack by most of the assessments I read at the time, but the shocks seemed to be pretty poor overall, and most people rated it as one of the worst shocks again here in 1993. So overall, the bike was improved in some ways, a setback in others. It certainly looked the part. It was a good-looking motorcycle, but in terms of performance, it was really very, very similar to the bike it replaced, and not a whole lot different. If you like that old RM, you're probably going to like this one, but if you're looking for something that pulled long and strong and was easy to ride, the RM was probably not your choice in 1993. The 1994 RM250 is an interesting machine in that it looks almost identical to the year before. At first glance, if you parked a 93 and a 94 together, you'd be pretty hard-pressed to tell the difference. Visually, you have a new white number plate in the front, and the graphics are slightly different, although it's a really, really tiny change. You have a little different graphic on the swing arm, and then a lack of graphics on the number plate. But other than that, the bikes look almost identical. But underneath that Clark Kent appearance, you have a much improved machine. Here in 1994, you get the introduction of a works fork for the masses, Suzuki's all-new twin-chamber design. Showa had been using this design on its works forks for many years. The innovation of the twin-chamber design was to seal this cartridge system into two separate areas to prevent oil and air from contaminating and frothing within the fork. This provided more consistent damping over a longer period of time. There was also a larger oil lock system here in 1994 to provide full travel compression with less harshness. These forks, as I said, are a very similar fork to what was used on the works Hondas at the time, and really, in many forks still use this exact same system today. It really was kind of a jump in technology, just like in 1986 with the introduction of the original cartridge forks on Hondas there in 86. Now, in addition to the all-new Super Trick fork, you get a completely redone motor this year. Visually, it looks very similar to the old design, and the basic layout is the same. It's still a case reed engine with using the same power valve setup, but they added all new cases throughout the motor because they were going to reposition the crankcase and intake track this year. You get all new crankcase with a straightened intake track to smooth power delivery and increase throttle response. You have all new exhaust port timing to improve mid-range power. They retuned the exhaust pipe. It's a reshaped exhaust this year to go with the new motor settings. They moved from a single ring to a two-ring piston this year to improve longevity and offer better sealing. The crankshaft bearings are upgraded for improved durability. They also strengthened the clutch, and interestingly, they took back the additional clutch plate they had added a couple of years before. A new clutch cable was added, which was larger overall and featured a new low-friction cable coating to provide smooth response. The shock was revised here in 1994. You have an all-new linkage. That was one of the beefs with the 93 design. The linkage and the shock did not work very well, kind of gave the machine a hobby horse, stink bug feel, and I think most people thought that shock was pretty poor overall. For 1994, you get a small update in braking. Suzuki changed the pad material, both front and rear, to improve braking feel and durability. As I had mentioned, in 1993, Suzuki had actually widened the machine to allow people to have a little bit more to grab a hold of, but not everybody liked this change. It seems that some riders, particularly ones who wore knee braces, thought the wider midsection was intrusive. So for 94, they slimmed it down a little bit and narrowed the midsection 20 millimeters to provide a little more room for riders with knee braces and larger legs to kind of fit more comfortably on the machine. Overall, it was a pretty significant update to a machine that was all new the year before, and it paid substantial dividends on the track. The new motor was much improved. It still was mostly a mid-range engine. There wasn't a whole lot of low-end or top-end power, but that power band was wider for 94. And perhaps most importantly, the machine felt much more metered in its delivery. Even though they did not add additional flywheel weight, the motor felt like it did. The new intake track and porting changes built power more slowly and more controllably. So the RM was easier to ride. It didn't have that 125 no power, then all the power feel. It came on a little steadier and was much easier to get hooked up. The bike still, again, felt like an RM, but it was an improved RM. A lot of riders thought it was maybe the second best motor of 1994, which is something no one would have said the previous 4 years. The bike was much improved in terms of motor performance. It was very fast. Still not as fast as the Honda. The CR250 still romped and stomped on the competition. On the dyno, Honda's CR put out about 3 more horsepower than this RM, so it wasn't anywhere close in terms of that. But on the track, it actually felt better than the dyno said. It was a very controllable, rideable engine here in 94, and I think most people thought it was a really significant improvement. The twin-chamber fork was only mid-pack performer here this year. The shock out back was mid-pack as well, but that was an improvement because it was considered probably the worst suspension in 93. So this 94 design is, pretty much right in the middle of the ratings when you look at the shootouts at the time. I think it was more settings, though. This twin-chamber fork was incredibly trick, and certainly it is proven to be an excellent fork design, but the settings here in 94 didn't seem to take advantage of all of its potential. Kawasaki in 94 kind of had suspension on lock. They had the best suspension front and rear in 94. And the RM was certainly raceable in terms of suspension performance, but it wasn't like quite as plush as the Kawasaki this season. I think most people, their main beef with the RM was in the handling. Again, it was an extremely excellent turning machine, but the bike was just kind of sketchy. It was one of these machines that unloaded the front end as soon as you got on the power. So unlike the CR, which tended to head shake under deceleration, the RM head shaked under acceleration. You'd come out of a turn, hit a bump, the front end unloads, and the front end kind of oscillates, shakes. It was pretty scary. Again, if you weren't used to the way these things handled, it could be pretty sketchy. And the RM125, it did handle similarly, but the added weight and power of the 250 kind of exacerbated that. And the bike could be kind of spooky to ride at times. And that seems to be the main beef people had with it. If you were going to ride it exclusively on a real tight, smaller track, it was probably fine. But outdoors at places like Glen Helen, the bike could be pretty sketchy. That seemed to be the main problem people had with the bike in 94. Overall, again, suspension was certainly raceable, pretty good, certainly better than what Honda had on their bikes this year. The motor was much improved, but the handling of this chassis just really was never quite up to snuff to run with the best machines in the class. For 1995, the RM250 is back for the last year of its design cycle. This is the last year of this current bodywork and design, and this is a bike I actually owned. I owned a 95 RM250. It was a machine that I personally hated. It's one of the bikes that I have least liked that I've owned. At the time, I was coming off of a Honda CR250, and this bike was so utterly different. I really had a hard time adapting to it. Visually, the RM looks almost the same as it did the 2 previous years. You had a minor update in the graphics. The graphics on the shroud is the same basic design, but the color is swapped a little bit. And you'll notice that the little tang that prevents your boots from catching on the side plates is white and not black, so it's a little more obvious. Other than a graphic update, you do get some pretty significant motor updates here in 95. Back in the early 80s, when power valves were first coming into vogue, you had 2 basic designs. You had the exhaust valve resonance chamber, a la Honda's ATAC system, and then you had the variable exhaust port, which is what Yamaha went with their Yamaha power valve system. Over time, it seems like the exhaust port variable exhaust port seemed to be the more successful design, and most of the manufacturers moved away from the resonance chambers. But eventually, by the mid-90s, most of the manufacturers had decided that the combination of the both systems, like Kawasaki was using with their KIP system, provided the most broad power in a two-stroke design. Here in 1995, both Yamaha and Suzuki brought the exhaust resonance chambers back to their power valve design. So they had both a variable exhaust port and a exhaust resonance chamber. Now, the exhaust resonance chamber, what it basically did was change exhaust pipe volume, more or less like having two different expansion chambers in the same pipe. At low RPMs, the chamber opened up, increasing head pipe volume, and in theory at least, beefing up the low-end power. Here in 1995, Suzuki added that to their power valve system, so you get an all-new power valve design with an integrated exhaust valve resonance chamber to go with the sliding guillotine valves that it had been using for several years. You also have a slight increase in flywheel mass. Again, these super revvy RM250 case reed motors always kind of spun up fast, and they were always trying to kind of tweak that power to have them be a little more tractable. In 94, they were very successful at that, and here in 95, they beefed up the flywheel a little bit more to try and slow things down. Here in 95, the expansion chamber is also redesigned to work with the new power valve system and revised porting. You also have a new clutch hub sleeve material, which was designed to give smoother action. It seems like Suzuki every year was kind of playing with their clutches, trying to get better, more reliable action. They always had a very light pull, but some of the RM clutches didn't seem to take too well to abuse, so they're always kind of tweaking that stuff. They revised the kickstart swivel joint to have a more positive action. They also added a new rear shock absorber with redesigned check valve for better oil flow. They changed the front and rear brake pad material again for 1995. And you also get an all-new throttle this year. They went with a Gunner Gasser Whirlpool style throttle, which was designed to be lighter at the pull and provide less fatigue to the rider. The Showa twin chamber forks here were back again for 1995, and they featured new settings and also some updated fork tubes that were coated internally with molybdenum and Teflon to reduce friction between the inner and outer tubes. They buffed the fork springs internally, also to lower friction, and added Teflon-coated dust seals. Obviously, stiction and friction are really big hindrances to fork performance, and Suzuki was trying very hard to get all of that stiction out of the front end. They increased the spring rate by 4%. They also tweaked the oil lock cones to permit full travel suspension with reduced harshness at the end of the stroke here for 1995. On the track, the 95 RM250 motor ran much differently than the previous case reed RM designs. This engine actually had way more low end. That was one of the things that the previous ones were lacking. And here in 95, the tweaks to the porting and the addition of the exhaust resonance chamber really seem to beef up low-end power. This is a clearly low to mid-range power plant. It doesn't have a whole lot of top end, but it's very strong down low and into the mid-range, and was very quick from corner to corner. Definitely very different than some of the previous RM designs. I think actually most people thought it was a pretty good power band overall, and made the bike easier to ride, easier to get it hooked up. I think that was probably one of the big improvements here in 95. Suspension action was also improved. The shock was still mediocre in terms of its overall standings, but the forks were much better. The settings were better dialed here for 1995, and as I said, the basic system, the twin chamber, is an awesome design that's still in use. It just needed to be properly set up, and here in 95, Suzuki got much closer to that mark. A lot of people picked it as the best fork of any 250 available in 1995. As with previous RMs, I think most people's issue with the bike was its handling. That was certainly my issue. The bike had plenty of power. It was actually very fast. I didn't really like the style of power it had after the long, strong linear pull the CRs had. I felt this kind of snappy, hard-hitting RM motor was a little hard to use, but overall it was certainly competitive. I did well on it. But the bike put me on my head several times just unexpectedly. Did the same thing to Ezra Lusk. I saw, this was one of the years where you saw a lot of the pro riders really eating shit on this thing. And the bike would just kind of shoot out from under you unpredictably. The front end, it was always hard for me to tell kind of what it was doing. In turns, it turned very well. Obviously, the front end was stuck well on the entrance to turns, but when you put the power to the ground, it got very light, and the bike would head shake and just kind of do its own thing. And I found it sketchy. I thought it was scary. It kind of frightened me several times, and like I said, put me on my head. And I just was never really comfortable with the handling of the machine. And all the magazines kind of feel the same way. It's really the handling of this chassis was really its biggest hindrance. I think the suspension this year and the motor, much like 94, were very competitive. Unless you were going to ride it exclusively on like Supercross style stuff where it's very low speed and twisty, the bike was a handful. I just never could get comfortable on it, and it seems that that's the main thing that kind of was the demerit with this machine. The RM250 in this era was kind of a love it or hate it machine. I think people who love the RMs and were used to the way it handled liked the bike. It had a lot to offer, but if you were looking for something a little more stable and stuff, it was a little hard to get used to the way this thing handled. Next up is 1996, and this is a really, really significant year for the development of the RM250. This is a machine I had. I bought one here in 1996, and I absolutely love this bike. It was a quantum leap better, in my opinion, than the 95. I felt so much more comfortable on this bike. I liked everything about it better than the 95. Like I said, the 95 and I just didn't gel. I actually did pretty well in the 95. I had some good finishes, but I always felt like the thing was on the verge of killing me at any moment unexpectedly, and I really just never had that feeling here in the RM250 in 96. This year, you get an all-new engine. They went away from the case reed they had been using since 1989 and went back to a more traditional cylinder reed installation here. They also revised the exhaust port, had all-new porting. Pretty much everything about the motor is all new here in 96. The frame is completely redesigned as well, and one of the visual things you'll notice for sure is the new forks. At the time, there still was a great deal of debate in the sport about whether inverted forks were actually better than conventional forks. Some of the inverted designs had been pretty disappointing when they came out, particularly the Honda Showa units, and most of the forks really weren't that much better than the some of the better conventional forks in the late 80s. And a lot of people thought that maybe they were going the wrong direction here. So in 1996, Suzuki went back to a conventional fork for their RM250 and RM125. The new fork was much larger in diameter than the old conventional designs, and that was done to kind of basically balance the desire for more rigidity with the additional comfort you got from a conventional design. Those old forks, there's basically two problems with the old conventionals. They were a little flexy, and also they had a lot of underhang below the axle, so they tended to get hung up in ruts. And this new Showa twin-chamber conventional fork had much less underhang below the axle, and it had much larger stanchion tubes, and to kind of give you the best of both worlds was the idea behind it. You have all new bodywork this year. A lot of people kind of knocked it at the time, saying it looked like a Honda knockoff, but I mean, if you're going to copy somebody, copy the best. I think this is a actually better looking machine than the 96 Honda, in my opinion. I think it's a great looking bike. I love this overall design. The bodywork was very clean. I love the layout. I think it still looks great even now, 25, 30 years later, however long it's been. It's kind of a really good design. Maybe not quite as timeless as the early 2000s RMs, which to me look, just as great today as they did when they were built. But I still think this thing looks good even today, particularly this first generation before they went to the larger shrouds later on. Great looking motorcycle. Like I said, everything on the bike is new. There really isn't anything at all carried over from the previous design. This bike famously was the first RM to really have the influence of Roger DeCoster. DeCoster had moved from Honda to Suzuki in the mid-90s, and he was instrumental in trying to help develop Honda into the race winners they were in the early 80s, and he was trying to do the same thing here for Suzuki in the mid-90s. I think today, this generation RM in particular gets kind of a bad rap. The bike itself, I think, was very competitive. If you actually look at the tests of the time, riders loved it. I loved mine. Motocross Action picked it as the best 250 in 1996. The suspension, particularly the forks, were absolutely phenomenal. And I think most of that negativity comes from the fact that, Mike LaRocco, Greg Albertine, Jeremy McGrath here a year later really didn't gel with the bike. They felt the conventional forks were the wrong direction and the motor didn't have enough power. It did have less power than a CR250 at the time. I actually had a 96 CR250 as well. Maybe a year or so after this, I bought a used one, and actually, the RM was not as quick as the CR. The CR did, I will say, have a more powerful engine, but for my speed, it wasn't really enough of a difference that it made The other things that I liked about the RM disadvantage, I thought the suspension was way better on this RM than it was on the CR this year, and I actually thought the handling was a little better too. This RM turned really well, and it was much more stable than the previous design. Like I said, the earlier ones were kind of really sketchy, and they did a good job here in 96 of kind of balancing that out. So the bike still turned well, but it wasn't nearly as frantic at speed, and I really think they did it really well with this bike. I think pros certainly needed more power. They complained that the bike didn't have enough power, but it had a wide power band. The power band was actually kind of similar to what Honda was doing, but there just wasn't as much oomph on the power curve as there was on the CR. The CR was definitely faster, but again, for somebody, I was intermediate motocrosser at the time. I think anybody who wasn't riding the pro class, the bike had plenty of power, and if you hopped it up a little bit, I'm sure it was plenty competitive. Overall, I'd say this is one of my favorite motorcycles I've ever owned, and certainly one of the better RM250s ever built. As I said, history has been a little cruel to this machine, but I think that's more skewed because some of the pro riders didn't gel with it. And if you consider that 99.99% of the people who are going to buy an RM250 are not named Greg Albertine or Jeremy McGrath, it's wasn't really a fair way to look at the machine in that light. After the total redesign of 1996, the RM250 was back in 97 with a list of pretty significant updates. The motor was revised this year with an all-new cylinder, which featured revised port timing and a revised power valve system. This year they went to a two-piece sliding guillotine valve that was opened in stages to give a smoother power delivery. Some people had thought the mid-range was a little too abrupt on the 96 RM, and this was designed to give it a smoother, more broad delivery. They also updated the Kaheen PKW 38mm carburetor by adding fins to the intake bell. This was kind of a thing that you saw in a lot of the carburetors at the time, and this was done to smooth airflow into the carburetor and provide improved throttle response. There was a new stator with an additional coil and new ignition timing curve to work better with the all-new porting. They also reshaped the exhaust pipe to improve low to mid-range power. Clutch durability was improved this year by adding steel-driven plates to the clutch mechanism. The final drive ratio was changed slightly by adding an additional tooth to the rear sprocket to help the motor get into the peak of its power a little faster. There was a new frame with larger diameter down tubes for improved stability, and they also revised the rake angle slightly. The front hub was widened slightly and featured a new crossover pattern to increase rigidity of the front wheel. They also improved the front fork performance with a larger volume cartridge and less below axle extension. The forks, as I said, this conventional 49mm fork stuck down much less below the axle than the old 80s conventional style, but here for 97 they even made that a little bit less. So there really wasn't any real disadvantage in the ruts compared to an inverted design at the time. Pretty much the biggest change here in 97 is an all-new rear suspension. They changed the linkage quite a bit. They went to a basic linkage that was used on the works bikes in 96, and they did that to provide a more progressive action and gave it a little bit longer wheel travel. The new shock had a longer stroke and had improved damping according to Suzuki. They also increased the clutch lever strength and changed the shape slightly to make it more durable in a crash and more comfortable to use. Styling-wise, the RM was almost identical to the year before. Still a really good-looking machine, in my opinion. The only difference visually is if you get up close, you can tell the color of the graphics. Although the graphics look almost identical, the color's a little bit different. It's more of a yellowy orange into the graphic itself. A little bit subtly different than the year before. Like I said, if you parked them next to each other, it's kind of hard to tell the difference. Still a really good-looking machine, though, in my opinion. I love this bodywork. The bike was super slim, very comfortable. Overall, I think it's still a really good-looking motorcycle. Performance-wise, this was actually a pretty significant step back. The 96 was a better bike in pretty much every way. I think about the only thing that was on par with the 96 was the front forks continued to be excellent. Again, this is one of those things where people think poorly of them because they didn't gel with like Jeremy McGrath, but if you read any of the magazines at the time, or if you ever rode one of these bikes, these forks were incredible. I remember I would hit stuff on my 96 RM that I would cringe on my CR, and that thing would just absorb it. It would never kick, or you don't even hardly feel it. It was like a Cadillac out there. It was awesome. And I think, obviously, if you're hitting stadium whoops, that's probably not what you're looking for. And I think that had most to do with people kind of knocking it at the time. Most average motocrossers probably, I think, pretty much love these forks. They work really well, in my opinion. The rear shock, however, here in 97 was a significant step backwards. It didn't work nearly as well as the year before. It was busy and kind of punishing to ride. It just, some of the changes, the new linkage and what have you, just didn't work out. And most of the magazines panned it as being a much worse rear suspension. Motor-wise, the engine is more like the old Suzukis, which is kind of funny because the 96 had a broad delivery. It ran, like I said, much more like a Honda, just a much less powerful Honda, but that gave it, a real wide power band. This 97 version with the new power valve system and porting changes went back to a more mid-range focus engine. Like I said, the press said that new power valve design was supposed to give it a smoother delivery and a broader power band, but it really kind of did the opposite. The motor was much punchier and the power band was narrower, and most people thought the 96 motor, even though it was no powerhouse, was much better. Here in 97, the RM is putting out the least horsepower in the class. I mean, I think that's another beef that guys like McGrath had with it. The stock motor was certainly not a rocket ship and certainly not fast enough for LaRocco or McGrath. On the dyno, it put out 41.5 horsepower here in 97, and that was compared to machines like the YZ250 and the CR250 were putting out over 43 horsepower. So it was down, a significant amount of power, but again, it really depends on how fast you were as to whether that was a big problem. Overall, I think this was a better machine than history kind of makes it out to be. I think most of that, again, has to do with how the factory team fared on it, which was certainly a bit disappointing at the time. The 1997 season was a rough one for the RM, with Jeremy McGrath failing to defend his Supercross title, Mike LaRocco at some point actually refusing to ride the bike and trying to quit the team. It was a pretty big black eye for Team Suzuki, but the bike itself, as I said, it wasn't the best machine, certainly, but I don't think it was quite as bad as they made it out to be. But Suzuki was very mindful of that in 1998, and they really tried to make some changes to make the machine a little more competitive and kind of address the things that people had complained about. As I said, the motor was actually worse in 97 than it was in 96, so then Suzuki set about getting a little bit better power band and also fixing that rear suspension that was so jacked up in 97. You get an all-new shock linkage, which was very similar to what Kawasaki was running on their KX250. You also get a revised shock. In the motor department, you get new port timing, a revised exhaust valve. They also changed the routing to the power chamber, which was that exhaust resonance chamber, and also added a flat-top piston for better combustion and to give the machine a little more hit. The crankcase was strengthened around the main bearings for reliability, and the primary gear teeth surfaces were machined to reduce engine mechanical noise, make the bike a little quieter. These mid-90s RMs were rackety, clankety sounding machines. They had kind of a strange sound to them. Some of that had to do with the internal water pump, which was a neat idea where it was out of harm's way, but gave the machine a kind of a strange noise and made the bike sound rowdy even if it was new. I don't think a lot of people liked all the clatter, so they were trying to quiet it down a little bit here in 1998. Here in 98, they also updated the drive plates once again to enhance clutch engagement and boost the overall life of the unit. They used higher quality drive plates here in 98 for longer life, they said. The 49mm conventional forks were back. This is unfortunately the last year that you'd see them on the RMs, but they were back and excellent as always. They have a lighter internals here for 98 with a larger cartridge rod and featured reduced friction and revised damping. The carburetor is new here in 98. It added a power jet to the carb, which was a secondary circuit, which was coming on bikes here in the late 90s. It was basically designed to give the machine a boost of fuel when needed in order to kind of broaden the power band, give the overall bikes a wider power band. It's one of those things that one year the bikes would have it, one year they'd take it off. I don't know if it was, a complete panacea for wide power bands, but Suzuki was experimenting with it here in 1998. The frame has got some additional gusseting as well to strengthen that up. Overall styling is very similar to the year before. Mainly you're going to notice some new graphics. I personally don't really like these graphics that much. I think the 96 and 97 were better looking machines, but at least it has the normal looking shrouds this year. So overall, still a good looking bike in my opinion. On the track, the bike was still very competitive. The forks still worked excellent. They were the best forks in the class. And the shock worked much better here in 1998. It was much better overall. I think most people thought it was probably in the top 2 or 3 in terms of shock performance. Way better than the year before, where it was like the bottom of the pack. Cornering was excellent on the RM, and a lot of people felt this couple of year run here on the RMs, it had the best overall mix of stability and tight turning. It was a really sweet handling chassis. Some of that could be attributed to the fact that it wasn't that fast. Slow bikes tend to handle better than fast bikes just in general, but this was a really easy to kind of move around on bike. You could really throw it around and it handled very well. Low end power was actually pretty good this year. Low to mid power was excellent, but this motor went flat on top. There wasn't a whole lot of punch past the mid-range. It still was, down on power compared to some of the other rockets of the class. Certainly the CR250 was a super fast bike, and Kawasaki was just building some awesome low-end grunt motors at the time that were just torque monsters out of the turns. And this, I think most people thought the KX was probably the best bike this year. The Honda certainly had its people who were digging the all-new styling, thought it was super trick. The new chassis I don't think worked as well. Certainly RM was a better handler than the CR. Just wasn't as fast. So this was a better overall machine, I think, than 97, but still, unfortunately, not up to taking back the top place in the 1998 250 standings. For 1999, the RM250 was back with an all-new look that was pretty polarizing at the time. This year, you get a total redesign of the radiator shrouds. Suzuki increased the capacity of the radiators by adding a couple of extra rows to the core and enclosed it with a much larger and wider radiator cover here for 1999. I personally did not care for this look. I never thought it was very attractive, but I suppose it did offer increased capacity in terms of cooling. Suzuki claimed it was 10% better at cooling the motor off. Although, like I said, I don't think there were too many people that I'm aware of that were having issues with overheating the RMs the year before. Suzuki was certainly trying to keep the temperatures down here in 1999. Visually, the other major difference you see is the death of the beloved conventional fork. Suzuki had been one of the proponents of going back to conventional forks, much like KTM here in the mid-90s. And as I said earlier, all the magazines and most test riders and most riders that I know loved them. They worked really well, although the pros did not think they were, maybe conducive for Supercross or maybe absolute 1% top level racing. They wanted something stiffer. So here in 99, Suzuki kind of gave up the fight and went back to an inverted design. I think from doing a little reading at the time too, part of the problem was none of the other manufacturers jumped on the conventional bandwagon, at least, as far as Showa and Kiyaba. Suzuki was the only people doing this on the Japanese end. It was probably pretty hard for Showa to jointly develop several different forks for different manufacturers at the time, and I guess they really didn't see much of a future in it after guys like McGrath and them started putting the inverted forks back on their bikes. So unfortunately, after a couple of years, the inverted design was back here in 99. It is a twin chamber design, much like the previous generation. Suzuki claimed that this new fork gave you the benefits of the more compliant fork that was used the year before with the more inverted designs. I don't know. It seems like most of the magazine tests thought it didn't work as well. But that being said, unfortunately, that experiment was over here in 99. In addition to the new shrouds, you get an all-new set of graphics, which are, again, pretty controversial. I always thought these things looked ridiculous. It looks like the graphics actually spelled ROM because of the little hole in the shrouds. Thought it was weird. I don't know if anybody didn't notice that when they designed this, but they must have liked it because they went with a very similar design the year later. Other than the new appearance, you get some engine changes here for 99. They reduced the crankshaft inertia to improve power delivery and give you quicker acceleration. They also revised the cylinder base and intake area for better overall engine performance. The exhaust valve was modified slightly with some new porting here in 99, and they added a new coating to the piston, what they called black fluoro compound treatment, which was used on the RM125 as well. It was designed to increase surface hardness and reduce friction on the piston. The piston also get a new dome shape on the crown here in 1999. The PowerJet carburetor was back, and its fuel atomization was slightly updated here for 99 to provide better mid-range and high RPM power according to Suzuki. They revised the ignition timing as well to work with the new porting and new piston. The frame had some minor tweaks here in 99. They reinforced the swing arm pivot for better suspension action. Paired with the all-new twin-chamber fork in the front was a redesigned shock in the back. The shock did have slightly more travel here for 1999, and they modified the damping here for 99 to provide more initial plushness and a smoother stroke in the middle of the action. Braking was improved here for 99. Once again, they fiddled with the pads as they're doing every single year. And in addition to some new pad material, they updated the rotor in the rear to be 20 millimeters larger. The front number plate was also modified to work with the new inverted forks instead of the kind of trick ones that had covered up the front of the forks the previous couple of years. On the track, this new motor was more potent here in 99. It certainly seemed to be more of a hit than the 98 motor, which was pleasant but not particularly fast. This new motor was still a mostly mid and up engine. It didn't have a ton of low-end grunt. The engine, from what I've read, sounds like it was pretty snappy overall, but it wasn't a torquer in the way the Kawasaki was at the time. It was mostly mid and up, but it was very competitive. It was definitely faster than the year before. Shock and fork performance was pretty mediocre. It seems that most of the testers didn't really love the new fork. In terms of overall performance, the new Suzuki seemed to be a pretty mid-pack performer. The suspension was rated middle of the road. Dirt bike rated it third overall in the fork standings and second, tied with Yamaha and the shocks. It was certainly raceable in stock condition, but again, most of the magazines seem to think that the older conventional forks were better performers, at least for most of the people out there who are likely to buy one of these machines. The overall machine was middle of the pack, as I said. It finished third or fourth in most of the shootouts. It wasn't a rocket ship by any means, but it was competitive. Most people thought the bike was fun to ride. A lot of people did complain that the new shrouds were a bit too wide and prone to catch on your boots. If you looked at the comparison between the 98 and 99 shrouds, these new shrouds stick out considerably more, and they're, of course, much longer, too. So, again, if you're going to put your leg out for a turn, it was easier to catch it on your boots. Overall, it seems it was a pretty competitive machine, but certainly not the best bike in the class in 1999. For Y2K, the RM250 was back with a pretty minor list of updates. It is interesting to see what they did here in the motor in 2000, and that it seems like they completely undid everything they did the year before. It's funny how the engineers seem to try one thing one year and then switch back to the same thing a year later. Here in 2000, they went back to a flat top piston after going to a dome in 1999. They also reshaped the exhaust port. They did fine-tune the power valve actuation by going to the RM125's L-arm activation system, which apparently was more accurate and provided more fine control over the activation of the guillotine valves. They also incorporated a solenoid into the exhaust resonance chamber here to allow it to vent pressure at high RPMs. This was something that Greg Albertine had used on his bike the year before to win the 1999 250 Outdoor National title. The crankshaft inertia was also reduced here by 5% for 2000, and they increased the primary compression by approximately 2% to improve power delivery. There was a new exhaust system to work with the redesigned motor, and the PKW 38mm PowerJet carburetor was equipped with a new bypass starter circuit to improve low RPM power and throttle response. The CDI was modified and also relocated to inside the airbox. Previously, it was up behind the number plate and could be fouled by mud and what have you, so they moved it here to keep it out of harm's way a little bit here in 2000. The frame was mostly identical to the year before, except for a bit of reinforcement. They redesigned the lower frame where it mounted to the shock linkage to be stronger and prevent flex under heavy use, and also beefed up the swing arm here for 2000. Once again, we get new brake pads. I don't know what they changed. They're just new, and according to Suzuki, of course, I'm sure they're better. The foot pegs are wider here. This year they added a third row of reinforcements and widened the pegs considerably, bringing them up to speed with some of its competitors. And they also added a larger diameter rear axle and new rear hub to provide additional chassis rigidity. The motor, as I said, was very similar to the year before, except for some new porting and exhaust and revised ignition. It didn't run much differently, though. It seems like it was still a mid and up power band, very snappy, fun to ride. Most of the magazines also still complain about the clatter coming from the engine, but it always gave the bike kind of a ratted out feel, even though the machine was brand new. It's funny, Dirt Bike mentioned that they always thought the thing sounded like it was going to blow up, but it never did. So that's a good mark for Suzuki that it didn't let go. The suspension performance here was not much different than the year before. It was pretty mediocre. I think the main problem here in 2000 was the new settings in the front were too soft and the settings in the rear were too stiff. So I think most of the magazines actually said, taken independently, neither rim was particularly bad, but they just were really improperly set up. There was a big imbalance. The soft front forks allowed the shock to kind of overpower the chassis and gave it a stink bug feel. The bike continued to be an excellent jumper, even though it wasn't the lightest bike in the class. A lot of the magazines said it felt the lightest, partly due to that snappy power and the great ergonomics, aside from the really wide shrouds, which tend to grab a hold of people's boots every now and again. It is interesting that here in 2000, they kept the big giant barn door shrouds, but if you look at the factory team, they actually went back to the 98 style. Certainly, I think it looks about 100 times better, and I don't know, maybe Travis and some of these guys had trouble catching their boot. I'm not sure. It certainly did not seem to cause them to overheat their bike. So the only time we saw them run these shrouds was at Southwick that year when they went back to the larger shrouds. So it seems to me like it was more like a gimmick that Suzuki probably didn't really need to do. The graphics here for 2000 are very similar to the year before. Still has that ROM look to it. They did add a kind of interesting prism honeycomb look that some people like. I never really, again, cared for these 99, 2000 graphics at all very much. But overall, it certainly wasn't a terrible machine here in 2000. Kind of a mid-pack performer again. At the time, it wasn't up to besting the best machines in the class like the YZ250. But depending on what you're looking for out of your RM, it certainly was a competitive machine. And it wasn't a bad bike to buy by any means. After 5 years on the market, it was finally time to introduce an all-new RM250 in 2001. The new machine was redesigned from the ground up with an eye towards reducing weight, improving ergonomics, boosting power, and refining the RM's well-regarded tight track handling. To accomplish these goals, Suzuki looked at every facet of the outgoing design and made changes to reduce size, shave weight, and improved overall performance. The motor, frame, suspension, and bodywork were all new and featured radically restyled lines and a bold new color palette. The marble science yellow Suzuki had employed in the RMs for over a decade was retired and replaced with an all-new shade Suzuki coined competition yellow. This next-generation neon yellow positively glowed when placed next to the older RMs and helped reinforce the impression that this was a radically updated machine. Now, unfortunately, this would be the last major update the RM250 would enjoy. Here in 2001, this machine would underpin the basic RM for the next 7 years until the RM250 was retired in 2008. The bike would, of course, enjoy some refinement over those years, but this basic platform would be the last major update the RM250 two-stroke would receive. Here in 2001, the RM received an all-new frame that was stronger, lighter, and more compact than 2000. The new frame remained crafted out of steel, but featured an all-new layout that combined some of the features of a traditional and a perimeter frame design. At the front, the redesigned frame was thoroughly conventional, with a large single backbone and a single down tube that split into a dual cradle below the motor. Forward of the rear backbone, however, the frame split and resembled a Kawasaki design with large stamped steel spars on each side. This quote-unquote semi-perimeter configuration was engineered to provide a strong and flex-free feel while avoiding the wide steering head and midsection that plagued Honda and Kawasaki's earlier perimeter frame designs. In addition to the unique frame construction, the new RM's chassis featured a complete rethinking of the machine's weight balance and flex characteristics. Both the forks and main frame down tube were reduced in size, while the rear of the frame was strengthened around the swing arm and shock mounting. The new frame featured a revised geometry with a shortened wheelbase and an increase in rake and an extension in trail. Restyled bodywork slimmed the midsection and narrowed the tank and radiator shrouds considerably. The new pilot compartment was flatter on top and featured a sit-on rather than sit-in feel that made it easier to move fore and aft and weight the front end in turns. New fenders front and rear featured a more angular look, with cooling vents incorporated into the front and handholds built into the rear. In addition to being brighter in color, all the plastic was thinner as well to save weight. The foot pegs were relocated 9mm higher and 9mm rearward to complement the new flatter riding position. A new alloy subframe was designed that was lighter by a full quarter of a pound. Altogether, the new frame and subframe added up to a nearly 2-pound weight savings over the 2000 RM. On the motor front, the RM250 was just as all-new for 2001. The redesigned power plant retained the cylinder reed intake the RM had been using since 1996, but added all new cases and a redesigned top end. The reconfigured bottom end moved the water pump back outside the cases, which allowed Suzuki to both shorten the motor and make servicing and replacing easier. The new cases were nearly an inch shorter than in 2000, contributing to better mass centralization. The motor retained the same bore and stroke and displacement as the year before, but all the porting was revamped to improve power. The cylinder liner was plated with Suzuki's composite coating to provide the best combination of durability, lightweight, and heat conductivity. The redesigned top end was smaller and lighter, with thinner walls, reduced bolt sizes, and a more compact layout. An all-new power valve system was added that moved from a one-piece, one-stage mechanism to a new two-piece, two-stage design to provide more precise throttle control and smoother power delivery. The ignition was all new as well for 2001, with a smaller and lighter rotor and new throttle position sensor that was integrated into the carburetor to provide more precise ignition timing control. Both the transmission and clutch were also put on a diet, with the one-piece steel pushrod of the 2000 being retired in favor of an all-new two-piece steel-aluminum hybrid alternative. The primary drive gear was reduced in weight, and a hollow shift shaft was used in place of the solid steel unit employed in 2000. The shift mechanism was moved from a link type to a gear type for more precise engagement, and a new shift lever was bolted on with a revised shape and a hollow center for lighter weight and improved feel. Feeding fuel to the redesigned motor was an all-new intake, airbox, and carburetor. The new Kaheen PKW38 carburetor was 16mm shorter than the carb used in 2000 and featured the TPS integration needed to work with the new ignition and power jet for improved low-end response. By working together, the carburetor and ignition could be fine-tuned to provide the best combination of spark and fuel based on engine RPM and the amount of throttle being applied. Paired with the new intake was a redesigned exhaust, which featured a reconfigured shape and thinner walled stampings to reduce weight. Combined with the all-new alloy silencer, the exhaust system dropped nearly 2 pounds of weight from 2000. On the suspension front, the RM was once again majorly revamped in 2001. After using Showa components for several years, Suzuki moved back to Kiaba on the RM250 in 2001. The all-new 46mm KYB forks were 3mm smaller in diameter than the old Showa components and very similar to the forks found on the KX250. The new smaller diameter forks lowered weight by 1.76 pounds and dialed back the rigidity of the RM's front end to better work with the flex characteristics of the new frame. Internally, the forks featured an air bladder and check plate to divide oil and air into two separate chambers. This air bladder was designed to increase pressure in the upper fork to hold some travel in reserve to prevent bottoming on successive hits. In the rear, the RM once again moved to Kayaba as a suspension provider. The all-new KYB shock added high and low speed compression damping control for 2001 to go with a full range of selectable rebound settings. The new shock was paired with a redesigned linkage and an all-new swing arm design. To reduce weight, the upper shock mount was moved to a needle bearing design, and the shock body was reduced in diameter by 4mm. This downsizing saved over half a pound when compared to the 2000 shock design. All new brakes shaved weight by reducing the thickness of the rotors by 0.5mm and increasing the size of the venting on the front rotor. An all-new one-piece integrated rear master cylinder further saved weight by reducing the size and eliminating the need for a protective cover. Up front, Suzuki eliminated the plastic rotor cover and reduced the width of the front hub by 20mm. An all-new brake pedal featured a revamped shape for improved feel and a 1mm thinner construction for a 2.76-ounce savings in weight. Even the clutch and throttle controls were trimmed, shaved, and reworked to find additional ounces that could be shed. Redesigning the clutch perch and free play adjuster saved 2.6 ounces, and revamping the throttle cable mounting shed 0.79 ounces from the 2000 design. All told, these changes added up to a remarkable 9 pounds of weight savings for the 2001 RM250. On the track, the all-new RM250 felt very different in some ways and largely unchanged in others. The new layout was ultra-thin, but a good bit more cramped than previous RMs. The new bodywork and foot peg placement cut half an inch out of reach from the pegs to the seat, while this made the bike feel very compact. Tall riders felt that the updated ergonomics were a bit too confining. While this layout was new, the RM's handling remained largely unchanged. At 222 pounds, the RM undercut every other machine in the class besides Honda's aluminum frame CR250, and this lightweight was apparent from the second you took the bike off the stand. In the air or on the ground, the RM was incredibly nimble, with a feathery feel that was more akin to a powerful 125 than a traditional 250. Turning remained excellent, and the RM had little trouble carving under its red, blue, green, and orange competition. Jumping the Suzuki was also a joy, and the bike could be whipped, flipped, and flattened like a BMX machine. As with previous RM250s, however, stability was a bit of an issue. The bike danced around at speed and never felt fully planted to the ground. It rarely did anything truly scary, but also moved around quite a bit more than many riders were comfortable with. The chassis felt like a cat poised to strike and ready to change direction and pounce at a moment's notice. Many riders loved this quick and responsive feel, but not everyone could come to terms with its hyperactive nature. Also playing into this hyperactive personality for 2001 was the RM's redesigned engine. The new power plant provided a hard-hitting and quick-revving style of power that spooled up fast and blasted the machine out of every corner. The motor's light flywheel made it incredibly responsive to throttle input, but there was less traditional grunt down low than on the YZ, KX, or KTM. Most of its power was situated dead center in the mid-range, and the RM was incredibly quick once it hit the meat of its power band. Top-end power, however, was rather unimpressive, and it was better to shift rather than try and scream it into the next corner. Selecting the proper gear and keeping a finger on the clutch were critical to making the RM's punchy delivery work. This quick-hitting rat-a-tat style of power was great on tight tracks, and the bike could be really fun to ride, but most racers felt the broad power of the Yamaha and long pull of the Honda were superior in 2001. Overall, the all-new 2001 RM250 turned out to be a major step forward for the RM in most ways. The bike was much lighter, the ergonomics were excellent, and the bike was super fun to ride, but it was a bit of a work in progress here in 2001. The motor's power band was a bit narrow and the suspension was too soft, but clearly they had the underpinnings for an excellent machine moving forward. It was certainly a great starting point for the all-new design. It would take a couple years, I think, for Suzuki to get everything just quite right on this machine, but this 2001 certainly set the ball rolling in the right direction for Suzuki to have an excellent machine going forward. For 2002, the RM250 was back with a modest list of updates. As I said, the machine was all new the year before, so you wouldn't expect a complete redesign here in 2002. Visually, the bike looks almost identical, although I will say I like the O2 graphics a little better. I think they're cleaner, good-looking machine, although the bike continued to have graphics that didn't seem to last very long. All the magazines complained that they were not long for this world, so if you like the look of them, you better cover them with some kind of plastic or something. They're going to be going pretty quick. Internally, the motor gets some updates here, of course. For 2002, you get a redesigned power valve system. After having a complete redesign the year before, they went to an all-new configuration this year, and they moved to a one-piece instead of a dual-piece exhaust valve, which was designed to increase mid and high RPM performance. The exhaust port is increased in size for improved mid-range, and the crankshaft balance ratio was modified for smoother power delivery. You have a tighter piston clearance here for 2002 to increase piston durability and reduce some of that clatter coming from the RM's motor. You have an updated exhaust valve actuator this year for increased durability. You also have an all-new exhaust system with a lighter weight expansion chamber and shorter exhaust silencer for reduced weight and improved engine response. You get a lighter weight chain, which is interesting because all these chains that were stock on these bikes are pretty junk, so I'm not so sure going with a lighter one was a great idea, although I'm sure most serious racers probably would have replaced it pretty quickly. They made improvements to the transmission here for 2002 with a harder steel construction for 3rd, 4th, and 5th gear. They reshaped the clutch release camshaft for improved clutch operation and clutch feel. They also added easier shifting in the transmission by increasing the gear ratio between the shift cam and the shift gear lever for 2002. They also revamped the CDI unit to be a little lighter here in 2002. The rear shock gets an all-new mounting point and change in lever ratio for increased ground clearance and improved weight distribution here in 2002. There's a new swing arm with a tapered arm design for increased rigidity at the swing arm pivot and improved rear suspension response. You got all new clamps up front that add rubber mountings to reduce vibration. In the front fork, there are several changes made here in 2002. They reduced the height of the oil seal case to lower overall fork weight. They added less air bladder compression capacity for increased resistance to bottoming. And they improved the balance of the rigidity between the inner and outer fork tubes for smoother movement through the suspension stroke. Thrust washers were added between the fork spring and separators also to prevent spring rotation and provide smoother spring movement. The rear suspension linkage was repositioned to improve tractability over stutter bumps and provide increased ground clearance. While the motor changes here for 2002 don't sound particularly groundbreaking, the bike did run much better this year. It's still not going to be a torque monster. The RM still ran very much like an RM. It's hard-hitting, light flywheel, kind of zippy power, but it's very potent here in 2002. The bike is very quick. It's certainly competitive and is able to run with its competition, but the light flywheel does make it a little more prone to stalling, and the bike can be a little bit intimidating to ride in that the power is very on-off, has a very hard hit and a sudden feel, and some people were a little intimidated, particularly if it was a slippery track surface. The rear suspension and front suspension, again, is pretty mediocre. Most people felt it could do with a little more fine-tuning. The overall machine was a good handler and certainly excellent in the turns, still a little bit schizoid at speed, but overall the RM was a very competitive machine here in 2002. It seems that most people's complaints were centered around the overall reliability of the machine, which was fairly poor. The bikes did not seem to hold up very well to abuse. The seat got very soft very quickly. The bars were butter soft steel units, which were poor even by the standards of most of the Japanese machines at the time. And like as I said earlier, the graphics didn't hold up very well. So as long as you were looking for a bike that was fun to ride, but you didn't need to have the most stable or excellently suspended machine on the track, I think it was a pretty fun machine. But if you're looking for the most competitive machine out of the box, there were better choices available in 2002. After 2 years of decent but somewhat disappointing offerings in 2001 and 2002, the RM250 was back and much improved. At the time, Suzuki was basically finishing behind Yamaha's awesome YZ250, and for 2003, Suzuki decided if you can't beat them, join them, and more or less copied the layout of the awesome YZ250 motor. Here for 2003, they copied the porting layout. It's really a case of see what somebody's doing, everybody likes it, let's go ahead and run with it instead of just trying to reinvent the wheel. The new motor offered a redesigned exhaust port and sub-exhaust ports. They were increased in size for increased power and torque. They also changed the intake port and scavenging ports for 2003. The reed valve was narrowed slightly, and the power valve linkage was modified to provide more precise engagement. They once again modified the piston, adding a dome shape to the top and reshaping the skirts for better performance and longevity. The exhaust pipe here for 2003 uses a new shape, and the wall thickness is also slightly thinner here to save weight. The crankshaft inertia was increased, and this is one thing I think that was really important to kind of changing the power characteristic of the RM2. These earlier RMs were very punchy but light flywheeled, tended to be very easy to stall. Power came on very suddenly, and it was kind of difficult to control the way they put the power to the ground. So here for 2003, they added a heavier magneto rotor to improve tractability and traction under acceleration. Give the bike a little more metered, slower delivery that would help it hook up a little better in slick conditions. They also changed the right side crankshaft end and oil seal to a smaller diameter to reduce contact area and friction. They changed the water pump to be more efficient, changing the impeller blades for less mechanical loss, and a smaller diameter oil seal for reduced friction. The transmission was updated here in 2003 with a new output shaft and an improved spline shape. They also changed the shift paw pin and added more durable clutch plates here and some slightly lighter springs. Also improving power was a new airbox that offered 20% more capacity and had new vents to allow a little more air. The seat was upgraded here for 2003. It's a slightly thicker and firmer foam. Early RMs, the seats tended to sack out pretty quick. And while the bike was comfortable and new, it quickly got pretty ratty feeling. So here for 2003, they upgraded that foam material to be a little more durable. They also added a thicker cover as well to hopefully help it last a little better. The forks were upgraded here for 2003. It still uses a Kayaba fork, but they went to the Yamaha style bumper fork instead of a bladder style for bottoming resistance, and this turned out to be a much improved fork here in 2003. The shock was updated slightly, not nearly as dramatically, but it did get an improved low-speed compression damping system for improved control. Foot pegs are slightly wider here in 2003, and the brake pedal was also repositioned slightly to provide increased ground clearance. The subframe cross brace was also modified slightly. The frame is basically the same. There's not a big change in terms of that. The RM doesn't really handle any different here in 2003. It's still an excellent turner, but the suspension is much better this year in terms of the overall balance. That was kind of the complaint people had the previous couple of years. The fork and shock were really not in sync, and that could really kind of mess with the RM's already kind of busy handling. For 2003, you get a new front rim, which has been increased in durability by adding a thicker material to the center and edges, and the front wheel spacers were new. You have all new rotors, front and rear, with a great deal more holes. Suzuki claimed this was done to reduce pad wear, which I'm not sure exactly how that works, but they also added a new pad material. Most people seem to think actually the front brake this year was a downgrade. It didn't seem to work as well as the previous couple of years. It wasn't quite as powerful, but it does look kind of cool. Here in 2003, the better setup suspension yields improved handling overall. The bike is still not a freight train at speed. It's kind of twitchy, but the suspension being better matched front to rear certainly improved the overall handling. The RM, it still had excellent ergonomics. Like I said, this is one of the thinnest bikes on the track at this point. And if you've ever ridden one of these things, they're really narrow through the middle. Excellent ergonomics. The bike is really easy to move around on. Super fun to throw around. A very, very good jumper as well. The new motor here for 2003 is much improved. The engine, as I said, gets a much torquier delivery, and it runs very similarly to the YZ250, which everybody said was pretty much the best engine in the class at the time. The RM is still a little punchier. The power band's not quite as wide as the Yamaha, but it's much better. The engine hooks up better. It has a smoother delivery. It's not so on-off feeling. And overall, the bike is pretty much considered probably the second best 250 in the class. In a lot of people's minds, the Yamaha is still a better machine, but the RM feels much closer than ever in terms of performance. Overall, most magazines seem to have picked the RM as like the second best two-stroke. The Yamaha was still better in a lot of riders' minds. It was easier to ride, and a lot of people thought it had a better combination of turning and stability. It wasn't quite as skewed towards one end or the other as the RM, but depending on the kind of track you're riding, if you liked this sort of quick turning and hard-hitting power, the RM was a super fun bike to ride, and this was by far the most competitive RM250 since the 1996 redesign. For 2004, the RM250 was back with a list of subtle and not-so-subtle refinements. The bike is visually almost identical. There really isn't a whole lot of change here year to year in the RM250 as far as the way it looks, but the machine underneath that skin is significantly upgraded here in 2004. The largest change is probably the switch back to Showa components for the suspension. This year, they switched from Kayaba to Showa's latest twin-chamber fork design and added a Showa shock to go with it in the rear. They also lowered the seat slightly by 10 millimeters here. They repositioned the foot pegs back 10 millimeters. They raised the handlebars 7 millimeters and added an all-new shock linkage that was designed to provide a more progressive action. The front brake was upgraded here by adding a Honda-style brake routing, which shortened the line considerably, and they also updated the rear master cylinder to be more compact and lighter here in 2004. The front brake also gets a full floating rotor here for 2004, which they said would provide a more consistent action as it allowed the rotor to self-center within the caliper. Motor changes here for 2004 include a retuned engine, which featured a reduced squish height for better low to mid-range throttle response. They also reshaped the sub-exhaust ports, port control rods, and cams for improved power valve operation. They increased the crankshaft inertia again a little bit here to increase rear wheel traction and smooth out the power, give the machine a more tractable feel. You get a new barrel type piston ring, which I'm actually not sure what is, but Suzuki says that improves the low RPM throttle response. They increased the power valve governor spring rate, again to fine-tune the action of the power valve for more consistent and linear power delivery. Carburetor featured a new needle jet, a new throttle valve, and some tweaks to the power jet for increased low RPM response here in 2004. And you get a new air filter with a larger mesh size for improved airflow to provide better throttle response and power delivery. They redesigned the camshaft stopper system, which features a reshaped stopper plate and a more rigid stopper arm for more precise shifting engagement here in 2004. Overall, this bike was once again quite improved. The subtle engine changes they made the bike even more competitive. The power band was excellent. It seems like all the magazines raved about how great this RM250 ran here in 2004. The motor was slightly more tractable. It still had a little punchier feel than the Yamaha, but it seems like most of the magazines thought it was a near perfect combination of power and feel. It was an excellent overall motor this year. The new Showa suspension seemed to work very well. All the magazines said it was excellent suspension this year, and the bike handled very well. Overall, most of the magazines seemed to pick the RM250 as slightly better than the YZ250, and this was the first time, again, that the RM250 had won a 250 shootout since 1996. It was a much improved machine. Even though the changes weren't really dramatic, it seemed to add up to a much better bike here in 2004. I think the real problem is, by this point, it's going up against the new CRF 450 and the YZF 450. The 450s were quickly kind of taking over the 250 class, but the RM was the best of the two strokes here in 2004 and an excellent overall machine. After winning several shootouts in 2004, Suzuki was not content to rest on their laurels here in 2005. They were back with a list of updates to hopefully improve the performance of their shootout winning machine. The RM250 this year does get a graphic update that I don't really care for. As I said earlier, I generally love this generation of RM250. It's a great looking machine. I had the 2006, but this 2005 version, I don't really care for the new yellow seat and the weird graphics. It just doesn't really work. I think it's probably better suited to the new 4-stroke RMZ 450, and it looks kind of tacked on here. I know that's a personal preference, doesn't really change performance in any way, but just my 2 cents. I didn't really care for the looks of the stock machine this year in terms of graphics. Mechanically speaking, Suzuki's engineers were kind of going for the same thing they had done in 2004 to improve the RM. This year they once again changed the porting slightly and redesigned the combustion chamber to offer a reduced squish band for improved efficiency and throttle response. Part of the reason that the RM was so much better than previous ones was it had much more roll-on power. It was getting much better traction out of the hole and was much more responsive. And they were doing a good job of kind of making small tweaks every year here to kind of improve that. This year in 2005, they slightly revised the exhaust valve and sub-exhaust valve timing once again to kind of fine-tune the power valve to provide the most broad and usable power. The crankcase received some additional internal reinforcement ribs for added durability, and there was a new crankshaft main bearing retainer, which made it easier to split the cases for maintenance. Crankshaft inertia was once again increased, this time by 3% for improved rear-wheel traction. Again, Suzuki every year kind of going down the same road, smoothing the bike out, giving you a little bit more of a controllable delivery, and I think they knew they were onto something here with this RM250, so they once again tweaked that again in 2005. They also once again tweaked the transmission for improved shift feel and updated the clutch to provide a smoother pull and a lighter feel at the lever. There was a redesigned kickstarter this year. The new kickstarter and internal components were added for easier engine starts. They went to an involuted type spline added to the kickstart shaft and a new starter ratchet gear for quicker, more reliable kicker engagement. You have a updated chassis this year with a new steering head cap seal added to improve steering head bearing protection. They also updated the swing arm design slightly by adding a new bridge tube behind the pivot section for increased rigidity and improved straight line performance. The forks were updated slightly here for 2005. They're still a Shawa twin chamber design, but they honed the internal surface of the fork here for 2005 for smoother movement, and also enlarged the oil capacity above the piston and shim stack for improved oil flow at full travel. They also updated the dust seal to be more durable and refined the valving setting for improved overall balance. The rear shock was also updated slightly. It was also a Shawa unit. They updated it with a larger internal rod diameter for increased oil flow at full compression and refined the valving settings for better overall suspension balance. They redesigned the chain guide for reduced weight here in 2005, and they also went to a titanium foot peg, which was also done to reduce weight. One really nice feature here in 2005 is the addition of a aluminum handlebar for the first time. This was something you had seen on the Austrian bikes for several years. Suzuki's notoriously came with absolute junk butter bars, and this new alloy bar was certainly an upgrade in terms of overall components. This year the brakes are updated slightly with shorter lines to lower weight, and they also reduced the overall diameter of the brake lines. They also updated the brake pad material again and added a new insulator to hopefully prevent them from overheating under hard use. They also changed the rear brake pad pins for easier brake pad maintenance. The rear disc cover was updated with new bolts for easier maintenance and reduced weight. There was a new air oil separator added to the rear master cylinder for more stable brake performance, and a new hex-style 8mm reservoir cap, mounting bolts, and 5mm master cylinder bolts for easier maintenance. On the track, the 05 RM250 was once again an excellent performer. The engine was pretty much the class standard in 2005. Yamaha was a very close second, but it was much better than the Honda Case-Reed engine. Kawasaki this year in 2005 revamped their KX250, and after several years of being very slow, the KX250 was a rocket this year. And I think in terms of outright power, it was certainly right up there with the RM. But the RM had a broader power delivery, and most people thought it was a superior power band in most conditions. The bike had excellent suspension, and the RM handling, it was one of those love it or hate it, but as long as you didn't have a problem with a bike that was a little bit sketchy at times, it was an excellent handler, and once again, the best 252 stroke you could buy here in 2005. For 2006, the RM250 was back with a surprising amount of updates. It's good to see that Suzuki was still updating the RM250 at this point. Clearly the world was going four-stroke. They had introduced the RMZ450 the year before. Ricky Carmichael had ridden one to the 250 Outdoor National title, but they were still putting a good bit of development into the RM250 here in 2006, which is great to see. For the new year, you get another update in graphics, of course. I will say I like these graphics better than the year before. Again, I'm not a fan of the yellow seat on here. I think it looks better with a contrasting color, but the overall look here in 2006 is slightly more attractive to my eye. The bike I had in 2006 was actually the Ricky Carmichael replica, which you could get for $300 more than the standard 2006, and I absolutely love the looks of this. I think that 05 RM250 that Ricky rode to the Supercross title was one of the best looking Suzuki Works bikes of all times. The Makita graphics, the gold rims, all of it is just awesome looking, and I just love the looks of this bike. It still looks great now, and it was a very fun bike. It was a bit of a handful for me personally. I always felt a little more comfortable on the Yamahas in this year. I think if you look at the tests, Yamaha and Suzuki are running kind of neck and neck in terms of performance here at this point. The Yamaha was a very solid machine. They had gone to an aluminum frame the year before. Great motor. I think the current YZ250 still basically uses the same motor going back to about 99 or 2000. And it was a great engine. Suzuki had kind of started out a little bit sluggishly in 2001 with the new RM250, but their engine performance had steadily gotten better. And by 2006, they really had it kind of nailed what they were looking for in terms of two-stroke performance. This year, you get some more updates to the exhaust ports. Suzuki in 2005 had tweaked them a bit, and here in 2006, they once again reshaped the exhaust port and advanced the port timing to optimize the boost ports. They also modified the power valve to delay opening a little bit to help low in power. They're, again, trying to make the bike a little more torquey. I can tell you from riding these bikes and having one, torquey is not really what I would describe this motor. This motor was very quick revving and snappy, but I guess this 05, 06 version was a little less hairy-chested than the earlier ones. It was a bit of a handful for me, but Motocross Action, some of the magazines love the power. It was very aggressive power. Super fun to ride. I just got to kind of know what you're getting into there. The bike was not, a tame little pussycat. It was a snarling race machine and hairy-chested in that way. They also updated the carb intake by shortening it slightly here for 2006 to increase low-end power once again. They also modified the crankcase here in 2006 by enlarging it to change the primary compression ratio, increasing mid-range performance. The crankshaft balance was also lighter, and that helped improve the power delivery. They made some refinements to the clutch. The clutches on these bikes were always super light at the lever. They had a really light pull, but they weren't the most reliable. If you hammered them a lot, they got kind of chattery, and it's one of those things where a Hinson clutch was probably always a good idea in this era RM. But here for 2006, they did make some updates to the plates to improve feel. The chassis actually gets a small update this year as well. They repositioned the steering head slightly and actually went more aggressive, which is interesting considering these arms are already very aggressive to begin with. They also modified the box section swing arm slightly to increase rigidity and offer better traction and straight line stability. Bikes continue to use Showa suspension front and rear. You have an inverted 47mm twin chamber cartridge fork in the front and a Showa piggyback shock in the back. They did to make some minor updates to the compression and rebound damping here for improved performance. In 2005, you got a aluminum bar, but it was a generic kind of a non-branded bar. Here in 2006, you actually get real-to-life Rinthal bars, which is a nice upgrade. Once again, also they tweaked the pad material for improved braking force. It seemed like every year they're kind of tweaking the pads to get the best compromise of feel and power, and these brakes are excellent. They had a lot of power and worked very well. The reed valve was also modified this year by going from fiberglass to carbon fiber. This is another one of those things where they seem to switch back and forth with carbon fiber and resin. I'm never quite sure which one's better because one year they had run one and then they switch back and forth, so who knows. But here in 2006, you did get a switch back to carbon fiber for the stock reeds. Overall, I think this is an excellent motorcycle. If you look at the tests, they really were rated very well. A lot of people love this bike. It really came down to kind of what you're looking for. If you're looking for a bike a little easier to ride, more stable, not quite so aggressive, the YZ was probably the better machine in the 250 class. If you wanted something that turned super sharp, came on real strong, had very explosive power, the RM was probably a more fun bike and a better bike for you. Certainly, it was an excellent machine and one of the best two-strokes you could buy this year. And for my money, definitely go with the Makita replica, one of the coolest RMs they ever offered, I think. By 2007, the writing was clearly on the wall for the 250 two-stroke. They had moved to 4 strokes indoors, and Yamaha seemed to be the only manufacturer who was interested in continuing to produce them. Here in 2007, you'd see the last model of the Honda CR250, and Kawasaki and Suzuki would quickly follow suit a year later, unfortunately. Even though the RM250 was coming to an end, you did get some updates here in 2007, so thankfully Suzuki was at least still putting a little bit of effort into the machine. Here in 2007, you get a mild update to the graphics, and you get an all-new seat cover with a textured side to give you a little more grip on the seat, help you hold on to the bike. The blue seat cover, I think, is a much better look overall. I always think the classic yellow and blue is the best RM combination, and here in 2007, it's a good-looking machine. In addition to the new seat cover and graphics, you get a redesigned cylinder exhaust port to improve power and torque output, and the sub-exhaust ports were reshaped to be narrower and shorter, and they advanced the port timing slightly by 0.5 millimeters. The chassis did get some updates this year. They revised the engine by tilting it slightly forward, and this was done to get the drive sprocket 3 millimeters higher and closer to the swing arm for improved rear wheel traction in the whoops. Front and rear suspension settings are revised once again to work with the new drive sprocket location and chassis tweaks. The front upper fork holder was also removed to reduce weight. On the track, the changes here in 2007 didn't amount to a whole lot different experience. Apparently the bike was a little bit more manageable, a little less aggressive in the power once again. Seems like every year they were kind of trying to mellow it out, and it still ran very similar. Like I said, I had the 06, and I would never have described that bike as mellow by any means. I've actually had 3 of these 250s in this era. I had a KX250 and also the Yamaha and this RM in 06. And to me, the RM was kind of like in between the hyper-aggressive KX, which hit like super hard and was really gnarly, and the kind of more mellow or easier to ride Yamaha, kind of split the difference between the two. Again, I wouldn't say it was mellow by any means. It was a very hard-hitting bike, but they were kind of trying to mellow it out a little bit each year, and the bike was more rideable. It is a excellent motor overall. The chassis change, again, didn't really make a huge difference. The bike is still a very aggressive turner. Suzuki kind of knew what they were going for on the RM250 in this era, and I think they would make minor tweaks, but it really never changed the personality of these bikes. From the 01 redesign forward, they were all aggressive handlers, And Suzuki was just trying to find the best combination of handling and stability. The stability part certainly wasn't a major priority. These bikes could be a little bit of a handful at speed, but really nothing on the track was turning better than the RM. So depending on what you're looking for, the RM250 remained an excellent choice in the 250 class and still the best two-stroke 250 in the minds of many. Okay, so we've reached 2008, and unfortunately, this is the end of the road for the classic RM250 two-stroke. This year, Suzuki did a mild update to the graphics, but other than that, it's identical to the 2007. This is the last year they would be in production, so obviously they probably didn't want to put any more money into it. Unfortunately, this is the last year also for Kawasaki's KX250. Honda had killed their CR 250 the year before, so only Yamaha would have a 250 two-stroke from the Japanese moving forward. I think if they still built this bike now, if they came out with it right now, just updated the graphics and the bodywork, it would sell really well. It was a super fun bike, and I think people appreciate now two-strokes obviously more for their novelty in a world full of four-strokes. They're not for everybody. I mean, the RM250 was certainly a very aggressive machine. I actually had the RMZ 250 the first year it came out in 2007, and I actually preferred it to the RM250. Even though the RM250 was a very fun machine to ride, I had them both. I rode them back to back. The RMZ was just so much easier, and the handling, I felt like the RMZ was one of the best handling bikes I've ever owned, and this RM250 was a little bit too aggressive for me. It kind of caught me out a couple times and put me on my head, and it was always maybe a little bit too aggressive for my taste. So I can understand why the four strokes caught on. I mean, they're just easier to ride, but there's always a market for these two strokes, and they're super fun in their own way. Now I am very sad that they went away, and Suzuki hasn't had the the kind of wherewithal to really bring it back. Considering the flagging motocross division that they have, it would be nice to see them bring it back and at least beef up their lineup. I'm sure they get some more sales out of it. So while it was sad to see it go, I certainly understand if they thought the sales numbers didn't justify it. Unfortunately, the RM250 wasn't able to keep going after 2008 here. So there you have it. That's a look back at the history of Suzuki's iconic RM250 two-strokes, a machine that for most years was very competitive. They did have a few turds out there every now and again, but every manufacturer has a bad bike or two in their stable. And the RM250, I think most years was very competitive. It is sad that they went away from it. Maybe they'll bring it back. Unfortunately, Suzuki's a little bit not doing the best in the motocross world right now, so it's hard to believe. But I think if they brought it back, they would probably sell a lot of them. So they would definitely use the sales. I'm sure the Suzuki dealers would love to see it come back. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the other videos. If you could share my content on social media, let your friends know, tweet it, share wherever you're on Facebook or whatever, I would really appreciate it. It helps the channel grow. And if you want to support the channel, again, I have merch available on my Teespring store, and I'll have a link in the description here as well. So until we meet again, this is Tony Blazier from the Motocross Vault. Keep the rubber side down. Peace.